Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. The rain began to fall with an almost deceptive gentleness, as if it didn't want to disturb our evening around the fire. The flames crackled and danced vigorously, but the humidity of the atmosphere seemed to defy their vitality. There were 5 of us that evening. Andrea, always vibrant and full of energy. Oswaldo, whose laughter could fill any space. Paula, more reserved, but observant and calculating. Lucas, the natural leader, who had suggested this camp, and me, who had agreed somewhat reluctantly, seeking a disconnection I didn't really need. The forest around us was imposing. The trees, tall and ancient, stretched out like infinite columns, their intertwined branches forming a roof that barely let the light from the sky through. Now, in the rain, their shadows seemed denser, more vivid. There was something about that place that made me uneasy from the moment we arrived, but I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to be the spoilsport of the group. However, as night fell, that feeling grew stronger. It was as if the forest was breathing with us, as if it was watching us. Everything changed when we noticed Lucas was gone. We had been chatting, sharing stories and laughter, and suddenly, he had simply vanished. At first, we didn't think much of it. It was typical of Lucas to look for ways to surprise us, perhaps hiding behind a tree waiting for the perfect moment to scare us. However, when minutes passed and he didn't return, concern began to set in. We called his name, our voices breaking the constant murmur of the rain, but there was no response. Oswaldo tried to laugh, saying he was sure to be back any minute, but even he seemed nervous. Paula, ever practical, suggested we wait at the camp. It wouldn't make sense to go into the dark and risk getting lost too. Andrea was restless, and I could see the same doubt reflected in her eyes that I felt inside. Something was not right. Time passed and Lucas's absence became heavier, more palpable. I couldn't just sit there knowing I could be in danger. I grabbed a flashlight and a pocket knife from our toolbox, determined to find him. The others tried to stop me, especially Paula, who insisted that waiting until dawn was the best option. But the idea of standing around doing nothing was unbearable to me. Andrea looked at me with something akin to gratitude, but also fear. I didn't know if it was for me or for what might be waiting in the woods. The flashlight was slowly illuminating the path in front of me, but the rain made moving forward difficult. The ground was muddy, and low branches scratched my arms. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves under my feet, the patter of drops against trees, the distant echo of thunder. I shouted Lucas' name over and over, but only my own voice answered me, distorted and mocking in the emptiness of the forest. Then I saw him. On the ground, a dark puddle that was not water. I approached, trembling, and the light of my flashlight revealed what I feared. Blood, mixed with the mud, forming a trail that led deeper into the thicket. My mind was torn between panic and determination. Every logical part of me told me that I should go back to camp and get help, but something pushed me forward. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was a mixture of guilt and loyalty to Lucas. The trail led me to a small cabin that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Its walls were covered with moss, and the windows, broken and dark, looked like empty eyes staring at me. I pushed open the door, which opened with a long, agonizing creak. Inside, the air was thick, laden with a metallic, musty smell that turned my stomach. The light from my flashlight revealed a dismal space, smashed furniture, rusted tools, and in one corner, a bloodstain extending toward a trap door in the floor. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my ears. The trap door was slightly ajar, and from below came an even stronger smell, mixed with a sound I couldn't identify. It sounded like a murmur, but it wasn't human. Part of me wanted to run away at that moment, to leave everything behind and run to the safety of the camp, but my feet seemed glued to the ground. and my hand, almost of its own volition, pushed the trapdoor open all the way. Below, there was a ladder descending into darkness. The murmur became clearer, and now I could make it out. It was a chant, low and guttural, repeated like a mantra. The light from my flashlight barely penetrated the shadows, but I could see something moving at the bottom of the stairs. I descended, feeling that each step was an act of defiance against my survival instinct. The subway chamber was wide, with stone walls covered with carved symbols I didn't recognize. Candles arranged in a circle illuminated the space, casting shadows that seemed to dance to the rhythm of the chant. In the center, there was a hunched figure, bound hand and foot, his head hanging. It was Lucas. I ran toward him, but before I could reach him, I felt a movement behind me. I turned just in time to see a tall, thin silhouette approaching, his face hidden by a mask made of wood and metal. In his hand, a long knife gleamed in the candlelight. My body reacted before my mind, and I raised the knife I carried with me. The figure paused, bowing his head slightly, as if studying me. The chanting suddenly ceased, and the silence that followed was deafening. The figure lunged toward me, and I barely managed to dodge its first attack. My flashlight fell to the floor, rolling away and leaving the room in darkness. The combat was chaotic, a mixture of desperation and pure instinct. I managed to wound him, but not enough. I felt the edge of his knife graze my arm, and the pain was like an electric shock coursing through my body. I found an opportunity to escape. I grabbed Lucas, still unconscious, and dragged him toward the stairs. The figure didn't follow us immediately, but I could feel his gaze glued to my back as we climbed. When we reached the surface, I slammed the trapdoor shut and secured it with a beam I found nearby. I didn't know how much time that would give us, but I couldn't waste a second. The rain was still coming down hard as I ran back to camp, carrying Lucas on my back. My strength was at my limit, but fear was driving me. When I finally arrived, Andrea and Oswaldo ran toward us, their faces full of relief and horror. Paula stayed behind, staring into the forest, as if she expected to see something emerge from the trees. I tried to explain to them what had happened, but the words came out in a rushed, choppy way. Lucas was still unconscious, but breathing. I knew we couldn't stay there. I told them we had to leave, that something was stalking us, but not everyone was convinced. Oswaldo insisted that maybe it was just someone trying to scare us, but Andrea and Paula seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. That's when we heard the sound. A rustling sound, followed by approaching footsteps. The masked figure had come out of the cabin. He knew where we were. There was no time to argue. We grabbed what little we could carry and ran for the car, leaving the camp and everything we had brought behind. As we ran through the rain, I could feel his presence behind us, always close, always lurking. Finally, we reached the car and climbed inside. Oswaldo started the engine while I looked out into the woods. Between the trees, I caught one last glimpse of the mask, the empty eyes shining as if enjoying our escape. When we left the forest behind, no one spoke. Lucas was still unconscious, but he seemed stable. I knew I could never fully explain what had happened that night, not even to myself. But something in me changed. Sometimes, in my dreams, I hear the chant, and every time it rains, I feel the forest calling me, reminding me that I have not yet fully escaped. The first time I realized something was wrong was on a Monday morning, when I received a call from a bank where I had never opened an account. The woman on the other end of the line told me about a large loan, tens of thousands, and the urgent need to update my details. I hung up thinking it was a mistake, a mix-up by someone with the same name, perhaps. But a knot remained in my chest, a sense that something much bigger lurked behind that simple incident. That afternoon, when I returned home, there was an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, no stamps, just my handwritten name and address. Inside, I found a stack of copies of documents, contracts, invoices, and a copy of my driver's license. Everything looked authentic, except that I didn't remember signing any of those papers. but the photo on the license stopped me in my tracks. It was my face, my eyes, my tousled hair, my crooked smile. But the man in that photo was not me. Something about his gaze struck me as odd, as if it were a distorted reflection of myself. I spent the night going through the documents, trying to find some pattern, something that would explain how they had gotten my information. The invoices were for services I didn't recognize, rented under my name in a city I had never visited. The contracts spoke of purchases I couldn't afford. It was then that I noticed something else. The signature at the end of the documents was almost identical to mine, but with small differences, as if someone had practiced it hundreds of times. I decided to go to the police the next day. I arrived early, with a folder full of documents and a sense of urgency that kept me on my toes. The officer who attended me listened with interest at first, but as my story progressed, his expression changed. He asked me to wait and disappeared for a few minutes. When he returned, he was accompanied by another officer, one with a serious face and piercing eyes, who invited me to follow him into an interrogation room. I didn't understand what was going on until a file was placed in front of me. There were photos, police reports, and newspaper clippings, a series of violent robberies, assaults, and disappearances, all committed by someone who called himself me. In one of the security camera photos, I saw my double. He was wearing the same jacket I had lost weeks before, walking with my same posture, even turning his head the same way. But that man was not me. I tried to explain that someone was using my identity, but the agents didn't seem convinced. They asked me questions about my whereabouts on specific dates, about purchases made with my card, and about people I knew. With each question, I felt the ground beneath my feet crumble. They let me go, but with a warning. I could not leave town and had to be available for further questioning. That night was the first time I felt real fear, not only because someone was destroying my life, but because that someone knew things about me that no one else was supposed to know. He knew my signature, my address, my habits. He even seemed to know my movements, enough to commit crimes while I had weak alibis. I closed all the windows in my apartment, turned off the lights, and sat on the floor, my back against the wall, waiting for something I couldn't describe. The next few weeks became hell. I lost my job after my boss received an anonymous call saying I was being investigated for theft. My friends began avoiding me, their excuses vague but constant. Even my landlord gave me an ultimatum after the police came to my building looking for more information. My life was falling apart, and I was powerless to stop it. One day, as I was walking down a lonely street, I felt someone following me. At first, I thought it was just my paranoia, but when I turned a corner and heard rapid footsteps behind me, I knew I was not alone. I quickened my pace, entering a crowded cafe to lose my pursuer. From a table in the corner, I watched as a man dressed in a dark sweatshirt and cap stopped in front of the place. He was looking in, searching for something or someone. When his eyes finally met mine, he smiled. A smile I recognized immediately. It was mine. I stood still as he walked away, as if he was in no hurry, as if he knew there was nothing I could do to stop him. I felt a warmth in my pocket and remembered I had my phone. I called the police, explaining what had happened, but when they arrived, the man was gone. I described his appearance, but my words fell on skeptical ears. To them, it was just another excuse, a desperate attempt to divert attention. I decided I couldn't wait for things to resolve themselves. I needed answers. I began to investigate on my own, looking for connections between the locations and dates of the crimes. I discovered that all the incidents had something in common. They occurred near places I frequented, but at times when I wasn't normally there. It was as if my double was planning every move to make sure that suspicion fell on me. It was in a digital file at City Hall that I found something that chilled my blood. A copy of a job application signed with my name, accompanied by a recent photo of me. The application was for work as a maintenance technician at an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. The place had closed years before after a fire that left several victims, but according to records, it was still privately owned. I decided to go there. I don't know what led me to make such a dangerous decision, but something inside me told me that the key to getting my life back was in that hospital. I arrived at dusk with a flashlight and a baseball bat as my only protection. The building was a skeleton of concrete and metal, with broken windows that looked like empty eyes watching me as night fell. Inside, the smell of dampness and decay was overwhelming. Every step I took echoed through the empty corridors, and shadows seemed to move in the light of my flashlight. In the background, I heard a noise, like a distant echo of approaching footsteps. I followed the sound, my hands shaking as I held the bat tightly. Finally, I came to a room that still had furniture covered with dust and papers scattered on the floor. In the center, there was a table with several photos. My heart stopped at the sight of them. They were of me, taken from different angles, at different times, at work, at the supermarket, in my apartment. Every detail of my life was there, meticulously documented. That's when I felt it, a presence behind me. I slowly turned around and saw it. My doppelganger was there, watching me with a mixture of satisfaction and mockery. He was wearing the same clothes as me. He even had a cut on his right eyebrow, just like mine. In his hand he held a knife, the blade glinting in the light of the flashlight. I ran without thinking, dropping the bat. The hospital corridors were a maze, and every time I looked back, I saw him approaching, his footsteps quiet but sure. My breathing was a whirlwind, and my legs threatened to give out on me at any moment. I reached a door that led to an emergency staircase, and I sped down, stumbling and falling at the bottom. When I reached the outside, I was met with police lights. Someone had called, alerting them to suspicious activity at the hospital. I thought I was safe, but when I tried to explain what had happened, they pointed their guns at me. I shouted at them that the real culprit was inside, but they didn't listen. It was only when they handcuffed me and took me to the patrol car that I looked into the building and saw his face in a window. He was smiling. Now, here I am, recounting this from a jail cell, as I await my trial. The lawyers say the evidence against me is overwhelming. They have no idea that the real monster is still at large, using my name to destroy more lives. But what terrifies me most is not the trial, or the prospect of spending the rest of my life locked up. What really terrifies me is the idea that, at some point, someone else will see his face and mistake his smile for mine. When I accepted the invitation to the reunion of old friends, I didn't imagine what was in store for me. After all, how hard could it be to share a couple of beers and reminisce about old times? We had all known each other since high school, a group bonded by shared experiences and secrets we had buried. None of us had really been close in recent years, but the invitation from Alex, the group's leader, had come to us as a kind of nostalgic comfort, as if time hadn't passed. But I knew, inside, that something was going to go wrong. It was one of those winter nights that embrace you with its dampness and cold air, ideal for a gathering at home. Alex's house was huge, like everything in his life. He had always been the most successful, the most popular, the one who held the reins of the group. No one questioned anything when he was present. I couldn't help but feel disconnected from that version of ourselves, from those younger days. Life had changed us all, but what we shared was still the same. And with that came the memories. I arrived early as usual and found the others arriving shortly after. Adrian, the quiet and serious one, always the quietest, quickly sat down on the couch and began to drink without saying a word. Esteban, the joker of the group, started cracking jokes as soon as he walked through the door. No one dared to say anything about what really mattered, the past. We knew something wasn't right, even if none of us mentioned it. We had kept quiet about the crime for years, even when we met from time to time. But that night something felt different. The first thing I noticed was how everyone seemed to avoid the conversation. It was obvious. Alex, with his usual enthusiasm, was trying to get the talk on track, to talk about what had become of each of us, but the words seemed to float in the air without connecting. The tension became palpable every time someone made a reference to the past, to the incident, as we called it. No one wanted to be the first to bring it up, but in the end, as always happens, it was unavoidable. The casual chatter began to veer into old stories of our youth. The memories, though always happy on the surface, had that bitter taste of what we had left behind, of what we could not forget. The laughter that filled the room slowly faded as the stories took a darker turn. We didn't want it, but the words were dragging us into that dark place we were all trying to escape from. The worst was when Esteban, in an attempt to lighten the mood, began to tell one of his oldest jokes, the one about robbing the neighborhood grocery store, a crime we did together one night as teenagers. It was one of those nervous laughing, play-it-mean stories that never got past the point of being a stupid joke. But even when he narrated it, the laughter in his voice was fake, forced. The group was instantly silent, each of us staring at each other, as if the truth was about to be revealed. Then I realized something. No one said it, but we were all thinking the same thing. That grocery store hadn't been the only crime in our youth. It hadn't been the most serious. It hadn't been the one that haunted our nightmares. The crime we never talked about had happened a couple of months after that robbery. The missing girl, Mariella. We all knew her. She was a girl from school who was always in the shadows, but with a sweetness that made her stand out among us. The story of her disappearance had haunted us for years, each of us trying to block out the memory, to ignore it. No one had spoken of Mariella after that night. No one. We had preferred to erase that chapter. But that night, the words let themselves out. It was Adrian who finally said something none of us expected. Suddenly, in the middle of the talk about old times, out of the blue, he blurted out a sentence that froze the air. It was just a whisper, almost imperceptible, but enough to break the bubble of comfort in which we were floating. The police never investigated that disappearance properly, did they? The words fell through the air like a pebble in a still lake, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. No one moved. The silence in the room became unbearable, and I felt the weight of memories crushing me. Something in Adrian's tone told me that he knew more than he had said. I stared at him, trying to read his eyes, but he quickly averted his gaze. The old stories began to change shape, as if they had been mixed with something much darker. Somehow, I felt like I was on the verge of discovering something neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Esteban, uncomfortable, began to fidget nervously, fiddling with his beer. Alex, normally self-assured, looked uneasy, with a shadow in his eyes that I had never noticed before. At that moment, I realized that we were all nervous. Everyone avoided looking into each other's eyes. Everyone was trying harder than ever to remain silent. There was something on their faces, something that gave away the truth. Mariella had not just left. There was something much more sinister behind her disappearance, and I was about to find out. The night wore on, but the tension was unbearable. The conversation seemed to go in circles, always coming back to the same thing. The furtive glances, the awkward gestures, the forced laughter. I felt my mind starting to switch off, searching for answers I didn't want to find. Then, when it was late, when night had fallen and the lights of the house were blending into the shadows, Alex abruptly stood up. "That's enough," he said in a low, almost muffled voice. "Let's not talk about it anymore." The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. Something was wrong, very wrong. The rest of the night passed in a foggy state. Everyone gradually withdrew, as if waiting for the other to do it first. I was still there, sitting there, absorbed in my thoughts. Something inside me told me that I shouldn't leave it like that I had to find out the truth. What had happened with Mariella? Why wasn't anyone talking about it? And, most importantly, what did my friends have to hide? It was days before I could muster the necessary courage, but I decided to go to the police, on my own. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I needed answers. No one told me anything, but there was something in their eyes, a look I couldn't interpret, that kept me awake at night. It was then that I discovered something that made me shiver. Mariella had been in that same group. She had been with us that night. The last night we saw her. The night before she disappeared. The night we had all gathered, as we always did, as if it were a simple outing among friends. But that night, not everyone came home. The truth was simple and frightening. One of us had done something irreversible. One of us had taken things too far. And worst of all, now I knew who. When my son disappeared, my whole world collapsed. It had been so unpredictable, so surprising. Up to that point, my life had been quiet and comfortable. My wife and I had raised Samuel in a city that, while not perfect, offered us what we needed to be happy. And my son, at 17, was an intelligent, curious young man with dreams of seeing the world. It had been a quiet spring when he decided to travel to another country for a kind of student exchange, a program that would allow him to learn and grow. Nothing out of the ordinary. No warning signs. The news of her disappearance came to me via a message that chilled me to the bone. An email from the agency that had arranged his trip. It said that Samuel had not returned from an excursion to a nearby city, that no one knew where he was. In that instant, the world crumbled before me. A father must feel invincible when he is with his son, and the thought of losing him, of something happening to him, was something that had never crossed my mind. The situation escalated rapidly. The local police in that country launched an investigation, but I realized that it was not enough. It wasn't her child that was missing. It was mine. And I wasn't going to sit idly by and wait for it to be resolved. No matter how many resources they had, how many agents they assigned to the case. A parent's desperation is stronger than any organization. I immediately traveled abroad without a second thought. I didn't care about language or culture. None of that mattered. I just wanted to find Samuel. As soon as I arrived, I went straight to the police station, where I was greeted with a distant courtesy. The red tape was endless, but the worst part was the feeling that I was not being taken seriously. Apparently, my son was just one of many cases of disappearances in the country. The answers I received were vague, and efforts were limited to a routine, non-urgent search. As the days passed, the silence became an unbearable burden. For weeks, I heard nothing from Samuel. No one seemed to know anything. That's when I began to investigate on my own. Somehow, I was certain that something else was going on. It wasn't just another disappearance. My son was young, but he was not reckless. I was sure that something had dragged him to a place he couldn't get out of on his own. I looked for contacts abroad, people who might know the situation, and it was a local journalist who finally gave me the first clue. He told me that human trafficking had increased in that region, especially among young people. At first, I didn't understand how my son could be involved in something so horrible, but as I dug deeper, the pieces began to fit together. The local police were not willing to talk openly about it. They would say that human trafficking was a problem that affected many nations, but there was always a tone of evasion in their words. The forged passports, the border movements, the unregistered vehicles, it all seemed to suggest that something bigger was operating, something they didn't want me to discover. I decided to follow the leads on my own. My investigation led me to a secluded neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, where the houses were gloomy and the streets were barely lit. No one wanted to talk to me there, but something inside me told me I had to follow. Someone, at some point, had seen something, and that was the key. I remember that it had started to rain that afternoon, and the humidity in the air made the search even more uncomfortable, but I didn't care. I was determined not to stop until I found Samuel. I went to dark bars and empty alleys asking the wrong people, and I almost regretted it at first, because the answers I received only filled me with distrust. But little by little, one of the men I met mentioned something that chilled my blood. There was something that didn't fit, but the rumors confirmed it. There was a human trafficking network operating in the city. Young people disappeared, taken to clandestine places, forced to work in inhumane conditions. I couldn't accept that my son was caught up in something so sinister, But as the pieces fell into place, I realized I was closer than I thought. What I didn't know then was what I was about to discover. The more I investigated, the closer I got to the truth, and I soon realized that Samuel had been marked from the beginning. The first contact with the network had not been a fluke. There was someone inside that organization who knew my son. I knew that now, but finding him, identifying him was another challenge. It was one night when a stranger approached me. At first I thought it was another attempt at intimidation, something common in those neighborhoods where fear was in the air. But what he said chilled me. There was a company that had been operating under the facade of a training center for young people who wanted to leave the country. Samuel had fallen into their hands by being one of the boys looking for work abroad. They gave them a false promise of a better future, and they took care of everything from travel to the new job. My son had never traveled alone before. It was his innocence that cost him dearly. The idea that someone had manipulated his desire to escape the routine and seek something greater filled me with rage, with helplessness. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't let everything he had loved be destroyed like that. The stranger gave me more details, enough to give me the courage to go deeper into the bowels of the network. I knew I was in danger, but I didn't care. There was no turning back now. My only goal was to save Samuel. The trail led me to an old abandoned factory, an isolated place where no one seemed to be. It was there that I discovered the truth. The network was bigger than I imagined. They were not only trafficking people to force them to work in inhumane conditions, there were other things, other businesses that were run from the shadows, all under the protection of powerful people. And the worst thing was that someone close to me, someone I trusted, was involved. My son had been one of many, but his case was different. He had been singled out, like a fish in a net that seemed to have no end. When I found the closed door of that factory, all I felt was a pit in my stomach. Something told me I was too close to the truth, to something I was not supposed to know. But a father's love knows no bounds, and I was already inside. Inside, I found a group of young men, some in worse condition than I had imagined. I didn't see Samuel, but my heart began to beat faster. I knew he was not far away. I couldn't fail now. What happened next was confusing. There were screams, people running, but what struck me most was the feeling of being watched, of being caught in a web closing around me. The police I had contacted weeks before arrived too late. I couldn't save everyone, but my son I found. He was emaciated, weak, but still alive. I still had hope. When I finally got home, with my son safe, the rain never stopped. It was no longer just a storm of water, but of pent-up emotions, of a dark journey I could never have imagined. But at least I had rescued my son. I don't know how many other parents have done the same, but this was my end. But I will always remember the lesson. Never underestimate the shadows that lurk in the unknown. I was a journalist, used to dark stories. I'd covered everything from political fraud to violent crime, but this case was different. It all started with a series of disappearances on the outskirts of the city, seemingly unconnected cases that no one else seemed to investigate in depth. The victims had one thing in common. They were young, solitary, and left no traces. The police had filed the files, blaming circumstances, but something didn't add up. The first solid clue came one rainy afternoon in my office, when I received a brown envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note with a simple message. We know what happened to them. Look in the industrial park, building 12. Along with the note came a USB flash drive. At first I thought it was another red herring, like so many others that come in when you investigate media crimes. But something about the messy handwriting and the weight of the envelope made me look twice. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop and opened the only file it contained. A video. It was less than 3 minutes long, but every second felt eternal. In the image, a girl sat on a metal chair in a cold, empty room. I recognized her face immediately. It was Emma Salazar, who had been missing for 2 months. She looked exhausted, with sunken eyes and matted hair. The camera was fixed, as if someone had placed it on a tripod. Emma was looking directly into the lens, her lips trembling, and although there was no audio, I could see her desperate words falling into the void. At the last second of the video, her expression changed. Her eyes widened in terror before the image abruptly cut off. I didn't sleep that night. The absence of sound in the video made everything more disturbing, as if the lack of a voice echoed in my mind. I couldn't get out of my head the way Emma had looked into the lens, as if she knew someone was watching her, but couldn't do anything to avoid what came next. The next day, I decided to follow the trail to the industrial park. Building 12 was an abandoned structure, with broken windows and a partially collapsed roof. The rain did not stop, and the sound of my footsteps on the puddles was the only thing that broke the oppressive silence of the place. Inside I found graffiti, debris, and in one corner, a small metal box. I opened it carefully and found a series of photos, all of missing persons. Some were images of their normal days, smiles frozen in time. But others were different. Photos taken in rooms similar to the one in Emma's video, with expressions of fear and despair. My mind began to connect the dots. This wasn't a series of isolated disappearances. It was something bigger. But who was behind it? And why had the clues been sent to me? Each question seemed to multiply in my head as the rain continued its monotonous hammering against the roof of the building. I took the photos and video to a contact in the police, an old friend named Hector who worked in the major crimes unit. Hector was one of the few officers who had not lost his integrity on the force, but even he seemed uncomfortable with what I was showing him. His reaction confirmed to me that he was touching something dangerous. He promised to investigate, but when I left the station, I knew I couldn't expect quick answers. This was something I would have to figure out on my own. 3 days passed before I received another signal. This time, it wasn't a letter or a message. It was an unexpected visit. I was returning home after a night of going through files when I noticed that the door to my apartment was ajar. I felt a knot in my stomach as I crossed the threshold. Inside, everything seemed in order, except for one detail. On my desk was a black envelope, larger than the first one. Inside, I found a map, circled in red on the outskirts of the city. There was also a broken clock. The hand stopped at 3 o'clock in the morning. The circle on the map pointed to an old processing plant, another abandoned structure. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my camera, a flashlight, and a small knife, more for comfort than for real protection. I arrived at the site in the dead of night. The rain was still falling and my flashlight barely pierced the darkness. The plant was in ruins, with rusted machinery, and the air permeated with a pungent smell, as if something was rotting. I explored every nook and cranny, looking for any clue, but found nothing until I came to an office on the second floor. There, on a dusty desk, was a notebook. I opened it carefully, feeling that each page was a macabre revelation. It contained lists of names, dates, and places. I recognized some of the names as missing victims, but there were others I had not heard before. There were also drawings, disturbing scribbles of hooded figures, and something that seemed a recurring symbol, a circle with a line through it. As I read, I heard a noise behind me, a metallic screeching that made me turn immediately. No one was there, but the air felt thicker, more hostile. I closed the notebook and put it away before hurrying out. In my haste, I almost didn't notice a figure in the distance, standing in the rain. I saw her for only a second before she disappeared, but that image stuck in my mind. She was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, and seemed to be watching me. I returned to my apartment with the notebook and spent hours looking through it. The connection became clear. It wasn't just a network of disappearances. It was human trafficking, a meticulous and well-organized operation that extended beyond what I could imagine. Dates and locations indicated meeting points, and the names included both victims and what appeared to be clients or buyers. I didn't know what to do with this information. Going to the police was too risky. If someone within the force was involved, it could put me in danger. I decided to contact Hector again, but before I could, everything exploded. That night, my apartment was invaded. I woke up to the sound of the door being kicked down and barely had time to react before several hooded men entered. They beat me, tied my hands, and took me somewhere in a van. When I woke up, I was in a cold room, similar to the one in Emma's video. A camera was positioned in front of me, and behind it was a figure I couldn't see clearly. I felt that my end was near. Then she began to speak. Her voice was soft, almost friendly, but what she said was frightening. She accused me of meddling, of breaking the rules. He said that now I too would be part of the system, that people would forget my face as they had forgotten those of so many other victims. I don't know how I found the courage, but when I was left alone for a moment, I managed to untie myself using a sharp corner of the chair's metal. It was a struggle to get out of there, running blindly through a maze of corridors as I heard footsteps chasing me. Finally, I found a way out and ran in the rain until my legs could take no more. Now, as I recount this, I am hiding in a motel, but I know I am not safe. I have sent the notebook and photos to several reliable journalists, but I don't know if it will be enough. They are still out there, watching, waiting, and the worst part is that I feel that, even if I manage to expose them, I can never really escape. Their faces, their words, and Emma's eyes in that video will always be with me, as a reminder of how deep the human abyss can be. It was a cold and wet night. The rain was falling with a hypnotic monotony, pounding the roof of the radio station like a steady metronome. My night shift had barely begun, and the phone lines were unusually quiet. The station, located on the edge of the urban core, was usually a lonely place at that hour, but that night the air felt heavier. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was fatigue. I worked as an announcer at the local station, a station that barely reached the suburban homes. My program was called Voices in the Dark, a mix of soft music and calls from listeners. The audience consisted mainly of truckers, night workers, and sometimes insomniacs looking for company in the loneliest hours. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave me a routine, a way to keep my mind occupied. That night, as I was adjusting the volume on an old jazz record, the phone rang. The red light on the panel came on with a nervous flicker. Something about that flash gave me a chill. I picked up the receiver, ready to listen to some listener who wanted to talk about their problems or just keep me company for a few minutes. But what I heard was different. It was a male voice, rough and broken, as if he was struggling with every word. "Help," he said. It was the first thing I understood amid the static noise and heavy breathing. Then what sounded like a thump, followed by an urgent whisper. "They're here. They're looking for me. I need someone to know." There was an abrupt silence, and then a final sentence that left me frozen. "The forest guards the bodies." The call was cut off. I froze, my hand still on the receiver. It was impossible to tell if the voice belonged to a prankster or someone in real danger, but there was something in its tone, an urgency I couldn't ignore. I tried to trace the number from the panel, but no luck. The line had no record. I checked the clock. It was 2:13 in the morning. I thought about calling the police, but I knew I would be treated as just another paranoid. In the past, I had already made a couple of reports about strange things I heard at night, and they had all ended in nothing. This time, I decided to investigate on my own. Before I left the station, I recorded this segment of the call and saved it on tape as a precaution. Something told me I was going to need it. The forest he was referring to could be none other than Blackwood, a place on the outskirts of town with a disturbing history. There were rumors of disappearances that were never solved, stories the elders told to scare the children. But they were just that, rumors. Or so I had believed until that night. I drove to the edge of the forest, the rain still pouring down in torrents, and my car could barely make any headway on the muddy road. The headlights seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, as if the forest itself was devouring them. Finally, I came to a small entrance marked with a rusty old sign. I was alone, and the silence was almost tangible. Only the drumming of the rain and the sound of my breathing accompanied me. I walked with a flashlight in hand, following a path into the depths of the forest. The shadows of the trees lengthened and twisted with each step, as if watching me. There was something strangely hypnotic about the place, as if inviting me to keep moving forward. I couldn't get those words out of my head. The forest guards the bodies. I moved forward for what seemed like hours until I found something. It was a shack, old and dilapidated, hidden among the trees. A dim light flickered inside, visible through a broken window. I approached in silence. Each rustle of the leaves under my feet seemed like a scream in the midst of that silent abyss. From the window, I saw a table covered with papers and an antique radio set, much older than anything I had used at the station. On the table there were photos. I couldn't see them clearly from my position, but they looked like faces. Familiar faces. I recognized two of the missing people who had been mentioned in the local news over the past few months. The air in the cabin was thick, laden with a metallic smell I didn't want to identify. I pushed the door carefully, but it creaked open. Inside, everything was covered with dust, but the papers and radio equipment were clean, as if someone had been using them recently. I walked over to the table and examined the photos. There were more than I had imagined. Faces of men and women, young and old, all with muted expressions, as if they were in a trance. In a corner of the table, I found a notebook. The first few pages were full of scribbles and symbols I didn't understand, but then I saw something that chilled my blood. A drawing of the radio station. It was a clumsy but unmistakable sketch, and in the center of the drawing was my name. Someone had been watching me. As I tried to process what I saw, I heard a sound behind me, a barely audible whisper. I turned around with the flashlight, but no one was there. Panic began to settle in my chest. I took the notebook and photos with me, leaving the cabin as fast as I could. I felt something following me, but I didn't dare look back. I ran all the way to the car, mud splattering my legs and the rain soaking me through. Back at the station, I tried to analyze what I had found. The photos, the notebook, the radio equipment. It all pointed to something bigger, but I couldn't put the pieces together. I decided to play back the tape recording of the call, looking for some detail I had missed. That's when I heard it. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was a background noise, an almost imperceptible whisper. I played the audio over and over until I could decipher it. It was a voice, different from the man who had called me. It was saying something, repeatedly. Don't go off the air. The phone rang again. This time the line was completely silent as I answered, but I felt a presence, as if someone was there listening. I hung up with a thud, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep that night. I checked the notebook and noticed something I hadn't seen before. Dates and times written next to coordinates. The times matched the times of calls I had received in the past few weeks. Calls I had ignored, thinking they were pranks or mistakes. But now he saw the pattern. Each call preceded a disappearance. The last date noted was for that same night, at 3:00 a.m. The clock read 2:47. I decided to stay at the station and keep the program on the air, as a kind of desperate act. I felt that somehow the words on the audio were a warning. If I went off the air, something terrible would happen. At 3:00, the panel light came on again. I answered, my voice barely a whisper. There was no response at first, just static. But then I heard a sound I recognized immediately. Footsteps, as if someone was walking on dry leaves. I looked out the cabin window, but outside there was only rain. The footsteps continued, closer and closer, until the line abruptly cut off. That's when I saw him. Reflected in the glass of the booth, a dark figure behind me, motionless. I turned suddenly, but no one was there. The station light flickered, and the equipment began to emit interference. I felt that something was with me, something I couldn't see but could feel. I don't remember how that night ended. I only know that, at dawn, the station was empty except for me. The photos in the notebook were gone. The police never found proof of what I told, and the case of the disappearances was shelved as usual. I still work at the station, but the nights are never the same. Sometimes, as I speak into the microphone, I feel that someone is listening to me from closer than they should be. Other times, the whispers come back on the recordings, reminding me that the forest never forgets, and that, as long as I'm still on the air, I'm not safe. Night had fallen early, like a heavy blanket wrapping the city in its cold embrace. The rain drummed against the roof of my cab, and the fuzzy lights of the traffic lights tinged the wet asphalt with shades of red and green. It was my third night shift in a row, and fatigue was beginning to creep into my bones. But I needed the money, so I continued on, driving through the deserted streets of the South Quarter, an area that even in broad daylight seemed dark. The southern neighborhood had a bad reputation. Every corner seemed to hide a secret. Every alley seemed like a portal to a world no one wanted to explore. But the job was the job, and the clients in that area weren't particularly picky, either about the destination or the rates. All they wanted was to move fast, to get in and out without a trace. It was close to 2 a.m. when my radio crackled with a monotone voice, informing me of a request near an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the neighborhood. I gritted my teeth as I heard the address. I knew it was a place no cabbie with any sense would go at that hour, but my bank account didn't leave me much choice. I took the call, turned on the cab's lights, and drove toward the place, feeling the air grow thicker as I got closer. The warehouse was a colossus of rusted metal, its walls covered in graffiti that looked like eyes watching me from the gloom. I turned off the engine and looked around. The place was eerily silent, save for the sound of rain echoing off puddles and metal containers. I turned on the interior lights to indicate that I had arrived, but no one appeared. I was about to leave when I saw it. A hunched figure stepped out of the shadows, staggering toward the cab. He was a tall man, wearing a dark coat that was dripping with water. I couldn't see his face clearly, but something about the way he moved made me uneasy, as if he were hurt or desperate. He opened the back door and sat down, slamming it shut. We barely exchanged words. He gave me an address, a street name that I recognized as another trouble spot in the city. I felt a knot in my stomach, but started the engine. Driving in the rain always relaxed me, but that night, the air was charged with something I couldn't identify. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to catch an image of the man, but his face was still covered by shadows. He was leaning forward, holding something against his chest, as if trying to protect it. I thought maybe he was carrying a package, but the bundle seemed to be moving, as if it were alive. Suddenly, the man asked me to turn down a narrow alley. The request took me by surprise. It was not a direct route, and something in his tone put me on alert, but I obeyed. The alley was dark, dimly lit by a couple of flickering streetlights, and lined with puddles that reflected the red lights of a neon sign in the distance. That's when I saw it. 2 men stepped out of the shadows in front of the cab, blocking my path. They wore masks and gloves, and their silhouettes seemed too calm, too confident. Before I could react, the man in my back seat ordered me to turn off the cab's lights. His voice was low, but there was an authority in it that paralyzed me. I did as he asked. In the silence, I could hear the men outside approaching the car. One of them was carrying something that looked like a metal bar, while the other pulled out a gun that glinted under the streetlight. My client pulled a long knife out of his coat, and that's when I understood. I was in the middle of something I was not supposed to witness. I wanted to start and get out of there, but the man behind me put the knife against my neck before I could move. His message was clear. I wasn't going anywhere. The men outside started banging on the glass of the cab, shouting something at the passenger that I couldn't understand. My client responded with quick, cutting words, but to no avail. The gunman fired into the air, and that sound snapped me out of my trance. I took advantage of the chaos to push the gearshift lever and hit the accelerator. The car lurched over the puddles and bullets shattered the rear window, but I managed to escape from the alley. The man in the back seat hit me hard in the head, screaming furiously. I lost control for a moment, but managed to keep the cab on the road. I knew I had to get him out of the car before we both ended up dead. In a desperate act, I turned the steering wheel sharply, throwing the vehicle into a pile of garbage on a corner. The impact sent the man flying into the door. I took advantage of the confusion to open my door and run out into the rain. I didn't know where I was going. I just wanted to get away. My head was pounding from the blow, and each step I took on the slippery pavement seemed heavier than the last. I heard the man get out of the cab, shouting something I couldn't understand. Then, I heard other footsteps, faster, approaching from different directions. The other men were catching up to us. I found shelter behind a dumpster, trying to control my breathing. From there, I watched as the men clashed in the distance, shouting and struggling in the rain. That's when I noticed. They weren't fighting over money or some valuable object. They were fighting over the bundle my client had brought with him. I ducked into a parallel alley, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and them. Finally, I came to a gas station that was still open. I staggered in, soaking wet and shaking, and called for help. The attendant looked at me suspiciously, but called the police. When they arrived, I told my story, but something in their faces let me know they didn't quite believe me. They told me to wait while they checked the area, but they never returned. Instead, I received a call a few hours later, informing me that they had not found the cab or the men I described. It was as if everything that had happened that night had been erased. In the days that followed, I began to notice strange things. A black car parked near my house, lights shining in my window during the night, phone calls being cut off as soon as I answered. Someone was watching me, making sure I didn't talk more than necessary. I don't know what that bundle the man was carrying, or why it seemed so important to them, but every time I close my eyes, I see the red lights in the alley, reflecting in the puddles like bloodstains, and I feel the cold edge of the knife against my neck. That night I learned that some things are better left unknown, and that sometimes the price of looking too closely is to become a target. The first night I was assigned as a watchman in the abandoned building, I thought it was the easiest job in the world. I was being paid to sit in a chair in front of barely functioning security cameras and patrol a place that had been empty for years. The building, a 4-story former textile factory, was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by vacant lots and wind-blown garbage piled up in neglected corners. There was nothing else to do there except listen to the echo of my own footsteps and the occasional creak of old beams. The first shift was quiet, if you can call the constant feeling of being watched quiet. Not by cameras, of course, but by the building itself. There was something unsettling about its vastness, the dark corridors and the dust that seemed to move as if it had a life of its own. But I convinced myself that it was just my imagination. I finished the shift without incident and went home, satisfied that the job was as straightforward as it seemed. Things began to change on my second night. During my first round, as I was passing through the 3rd floor, I heard a sound. It was a thud, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. I stopped and looked around, shining my flashlight, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I decided it was probably some old object that had given way to the weight of years and continued on my way. But the sound didn't go away. Every now and then, I would hear footsteps, soft and measured, as if someone was following me. But every time I turned around, there was no one. That same night, while reviewing the cameras, I noticed something strange. In one of the recordings from the 2nd floor, a shadow could be seen moving quickly down a corridor. At first I thought it might be an equipment failure. Those cameras were so old that any interference was possible. But when I reviewed the footage again, I noticed that the shadow was human-shaped. There was no doubt. Someone else was in the building. I did not inform my supervisors. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was because I was afraid of losing my job if I admitted that something was not under control. Instead, I decided to investigate on my own. Over the next few days, I dedicated my rounds to looking for any sign of intruders. It was then that I found the first clues. In the basement, which was dimly lit and reeked of dampness, I discovered a space I hadn't noticed before. A door that appeared to have been opened recently. The marks in the dust on the floor were clear, as if someone had passed through it frequently. Inside, there were boxes of strange objects, tools, flashlights, and something that made me take a step back. A gun, carelessly placed on top of one of the boxes. My heart raced. This was no longer a simple surveillance job. It was clear that someone was using the building for something else, and that someone was armed. I decided it was best to get out of there and report what I had found. But before I could move, I heard voices. They were low, barely a murmur, but enough to know I wasn't alone. I turned off my flashlight and hid behind a column, praying not to be seen. 2 men entered the basement, speaking in low voices, but with an urgent tone. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but one of them was carrying a heavy bag that he dropped with a metallic clang. Then they opened one of the boxes and took out more weapons. My hands were sweating as I tried not to move. After a few minutes that seemed like hours. They left, leaving me alone with the growing certainty that I had stumbled upon something much bigger than I could handle. When I returned to my guard post, my mind was in chaos. I knew I should call the police, but there was a problem. The men I saw had access to the building. If they worked for the same security company that had hired me, they likely had contacts in high places. And if I was wrong, I could lose my job and maybe something else. I decided to wait, observe, and gather more evidence before making any decisions. In the following nights, I was more cautious. My rounds were shorter, and I always made sure to return quickly to the surveillance room. I watched through the cameras as men came in and out of the basement, sometimes carrying boxes, sometimes just talking. I began to notice patterns. They always arrived between midnight and 3 in the morning, always in small groups, and they always seemed nervous, as if they expected to be discovered. Finally, one night I decided to follow them. I knew it was crazy, but curiosity overcame my instinct for preservation. I waited for them to enter the basement and followed them silently, keeping a safe distance. I saw them open a trap door I hadn't noticed before, hidden under a pile of rubble. One by one, they descended a staircase leading to a dark tunnel. When I was sure they couldn't see me, I approached and looked down. The tunnel seemed to extend for several meters, illuminated by dim lights set into the walls. I heard their voices up ahead, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Without a second thought, I climbed down the ladder and followed them. The tunnel led me to a larger subway room, a sort of makeshift warehouse filled with boxes and bags. The men were there, along with others I hadn't seen before. All were busy. Some were checking boxes, some were writing in notebooks, and others were simply standing, armed. In the center of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were cages, large and sturdy, with people inside. Some were awake, with terrified looks on their faces, while others looked unconscious or worse. I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. Now I understood what was going on. This was not just a group of criminals. This was a human trafficking operation, and I had been working on top of them without knowing it. My first impulse was to run away and alert the authorities, but I knew I couldn't just walk away. If I did, those people in the cages might not survive. I retreated quietly, climbing back up the ladder and returning to the surveillance room. There, I checked the cameras, trying to find something I could use as evidence. I recorded everything I could on a USB drive I had with me, making sure to capture the men's faces and movements in the basement. That night, when my shift ended, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to the nearest police station and asked to speak to a detective. I handed them the recording and explained everything I had seen. They listened carefully, but I could see the doubt on their faces. Nevertheless, they agreed to investigate. It was 2 days before anything happened. During that time, I continued to go to work as if nothing had happened, but every night it was harder to remain calm. I was afraid the men would find out I knew too much. Finally, one early morning, the police arrived. They blocked the entrances and arrested several of the men in the basement. They released the people in the cages and secured the place. I thought it was all over, that I could go back to my normal life, but I was wrong. The following days, I received anonymous calls, threatening messages, and even saw unknown cars parked in front of my house. The criminals who escaped knew who I was, and they were not going to leave me alone. Now I live with the certainty that at any moment someone could come looking for me. I did the right thing, but the price I am paying is high. The building is empty again, but the shadows of what I discovered there follow me wherever I go. And I can't help but think that one day, when I least expect it, those shadows will become much more real. The first day I saw my new neighbor, I didn't think anything in particular. In fact, I didn't even pay much attention to him. I just noticed that, like any other moving day, the house next door seemed to have an unusual amount of boxes stacked in the driveway. Not that it interested me much, as I've always been the type of person who enjoys his personal space and avoids getting involved in other people's business. However, something about the way the man who moved into the house looked at me when he crossed the threshold gave me the feeling that he was no ordinary neighbor. He was a man in his mid-40s, with a medium build, short dark hair, and a look I couldn't quite define, somewhat vacant, as if he wasn't fully present in the conversation. In the early days, I would only see him going out to take the mail, put some boxes in his car, or pass quickly from one side of his garden to the other. He seemed like a reserved person, and I don't blame him. Sometimes just moving into a neighborhood as ordinary as ours can be an exhausting process. At first, my curiosity didn't arouse more than a couple of trivial questions. But as the weeks went on, I began to notice certain details that seemed odd to me. It was nothing too obvious, but over time, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, and the sense of discomfort grew. One evening, as I was returning home after a long day's work, I saw my neighbor standing in his garden, looking out onto the street. The light from the street lamp illuminated his face, and, for a brief moment, I paused. He was not the type of person who would stare at the street for no reason. It wasn't something a neighbor of my type, at least, would do. It could have been a coincidence, but the idea that something wasn't right, like an instinct rolling around in your stomach, wouldn't leave me alone. As the days passed, my observations became more detailed. I began to notice that her house always seemed to be cleaner than mine, which wasn't necessarily suspicious, but it made me wonder how soon I could make it. No children, no pets. He seemed to live alone, and there was no sign of human activity in his home for most of the day. Cars came and went from his house with eerie regularity, always at the same times, as if they were part of a routine. One evening after dinner, as I was trying to relax watching a movie, I noticed a light on in his living room window. I thought it was strange because he usually turned off the lights at those hours. At first, my thought was that it was just a nighttime habit. However, after a few minutes, I saw a figure move quickly through the curtain. I wasn't sure exactly what it was doing, but something about the way it moved made my hair stand on end. It was a quick, almost mechanical movement. It wasn't the way a normal person would move in his house at night. I decided not to make a big deal out of it. Until a week later, something much more disturbing happened. I was in my kitchen, making myself a morning coffee, when I saw my neighbor again. He was standing in front of his window, staring at my house with an intensity that unnerved me. It wasn't a casual stare. It was fixed, as if he was watching my every move. I tried to convince myself that he was just distracted, but the lingering sensation that he was looking directly at me was so penetrating that, for a moment, I stopped breathing. That was just the beginning. The next few days, I began to notice something much more disturbing. I saw other people coming in and out of his house at the same times. There weren't many, but every time one of those people arrived, I noticed that it was always at night. The faces were indistinguishable, but something about the way they moved, as if they were hurrying, made me think they were not just visiting friends or family. Somehow, I couldn't help but feel that something didn't fit. My mind began to work at full speed. A few nights later, during an aimless walk through the neighborhood, I got closer to my neighbor's house. I hid in a corner, watching the window. I watched as someone else walked out into the street and quickly entered a car without stopping, as if it were a routine transfer. Vehicles came and went, and I wondered, what the hell were they doing? Who were these people arriving at that hour? The worst happened one night when everything came crashing down. I was resting on my couch when suddenly I heard a noise outside my house. I quickly got up, thinking maybe it was some burglar or something. As I looked out the window, I saw a man running towards my neighbor's garage. I didn't recognize him, but I saw him clearly. The figure was tall, and his behavior seemed strange to me. It was obvious that he was not supposed to be there. Fear gripped me as I watched from the window. I made an impulsive decision. I decided to approach without further thought. I couldn't just sit there knowing something wasn't right, and I felt I had to do something about it. I walked slowly to my neighbor's door, and when I got there, I noticed the light on through the living room window, just like before. I decided to knock on the door, not because I expected an answer, but because I needed to know something more. Just as my hand touched the doorknob, I heard a metallic sound, like a lock turning. My stomach churned. At that precise instant, a thought crossed my mind. What if all this wasn't just a coincidence? The man who had been watching me, the people coming and going, everything seemed to have a darker purpose. I went back to my house, looking for some clue in my own security footage. I played the videos over and over again, trying to find some logical explanation for what had been happening. That's when I saw something terrifying. In one of the clips, I caught a man entering my neighbor's house with a large suitcase. Somehow, at one point, I could make out a grimace on his face. I wasn't sure if it was a random person or someone related to something more sinister. The certainty that my neighbor was involved in something criminal hit me squarely. The cars, the mysterious men, the late-night visits, it all started to fit together. I decided to investigate further, searching for information about him on the net. I found little, just the essentials: a name, an address, and a brief mention of a job he'd had overseas years ago, before moving to my neighborhood. It wasn't enough to make an accusation, but my gut told me that all this wasn't simple paranoia. Something sinister was going on under my nose. One night, already desperate for more answers, I decided to follow him. After all, I was sure the police would not take my suspicions seriously without proof. So I watched him closely, hoping to catch him at some compromising moment. It was on that very night that I saw him. He came out of his house with a bag in his hand, walking quickly to the car. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared from sight, but I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening. This man was not who he appeared to be, and I knew that in the end, I would be involved in something much bigger than I had imagined. That night, as the silence of the neighborhood surrounded me, I realized something I could never have imagined before. The answer was closer than I thought, and even though my life was at risk, I could no longer take a step back. You never forget your first crime scene. It's something that haunts you, that remains engraved in your skin, in your bones. I knew it the very moment I stepped onto the dark street that early morning, when the cold air chilled me to the bone. It was a night like any other I had been on patrol, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered. That night would mark the beginning of something that would change my life, my career, and my perception of humanity. I was in my first months as an officer in the police department. Training at the academy had been tough, but nothing prepares you for coming face to face with human brutality. In fact, in the days leading up to it, I had been crossing my fingers that I wouldn't be assigned to a crime scene so early in my career. But, as they say, you can't avoid the inevitable. I got the call on the radio around 3 in the morning. The tone of the voice on the comm was cold, cutting. A murder in the old neighborhood, near the most desolate areas of the city. The kind of place where people prefer to keep quiet and wait for things to sort themselves out. I didn't give it much thought. Right away, I turned on the patrol car's lights and started up. The city seemed quieter than usual that night. The sound of tires on wet asphalt was the only thing that broke the silence as I drove towards the place. Rain was falling intermittently, leaving puddles on the street that reflected the lights of the buildings. It was the kind of night where the heavy air makes you feel as if everything is about to explode, as if the city is holding its breath. I arrived at the crime scene within minutes. The scene was desolate, almost as if I were in another world. A dilapidated building with broken windows and peeling paint. An old abandoned warehouse that had been converted into a homeless shelter of sorts. But this time, inside those walls, the misery in the air was more human, more frightening. The area was cordoned off by agents who were already there. My partner, Martinez, a veteran of more than 20 years of service, motioned for me to come closer. His face was pale, an expression of discomfort marked by experience. As I looked at him, I felt a shiver run through me. I knew something wasn't right. We made our way to the entrance of the building. The crime scene lights flashed intermittently, illuminating the place with an orange neon light. A musty, decaying smell filled the air. Crossing the threshold, the silence was heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. There, in the center of the small room, lay the corpse. The victim, a man in his 30s, lay on his back on the dirty floor, surrounded by blood. The corpse was partially naked, his body was mangled. The scene was so brutal that I had trouble processing it. The man's hands were twisted, as if he had tried to defend himself, but the violence he had suffered was indescribable. Someone had struck him with a brutality that had not been driven by a simple desire for revenge. No, this went beyond that. There was an emotional component, something personal in that murder. Martinez crouched beside the body. His face showed no surprise, only a strange sadness, as if he had already seen too many corpses to be moved. But his voice, when he spoke, was tense, a little deeper than usual. "It's worse than we thought," he said as he pointed to a detail. I looked at the body more closely. It wasn't just the way he was mutilated, but the marks on his skin, those deep scars that extended all over his torso. I got closer and saw it, the tattoo, a symbol I had never forgotten. A circle with radial lines, something I had seen years before on a case I could never solve. It was the same tattoo that an acquaintance had, someone with whom I had shared many hours in the corridors of the police academy, Samuel Ramos. I remembered Samuel perfectly. A quiet guy, who kept to himself in the shadows of the academy, always with his gaze fixed, as if he was looking at something the others didn't see. During training, I had crossed paths with him a couple of times, but I never really got to know him. All I knew was that he had a dark past, something he never talked about. He had left the academy before me, and I had never seen him again. But that tattoo on the corpse made me alert. Martinez looked me in the eye, giving me the impression that he had noticed the same connection I had. I knew it couldn't be a coincidence. The case, which at first seemed to be just another murder in the shadows of the city, had become personal. Something inside me told me that this case was not going to be so simple. Days passed and the investigation progressed slowly. There were not many clues. No witnesses had been found. No one had heard or seen anything. The body had been left there coldly, without any attempt to hide it. This made me think that the killer was not worried about being caught. It was as if he wanted someone to find him. He wanted us to investigate. As the weeks passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in an unsettling way. Not only had the tattoo on the body reminded me of Samuel Ramos, but it was a symbol related to a local gang operating in the city, known for drug trafficking and extortion. But something didn't add up. That gang had been missing for some time, and not much was known about its members, especially those who had been arrested or disappeared. It was then that I began to make connections with my own life. During my formative years, I had had few friends at the academy, and Samuel was one of the few who reached out to me. Although he never told me about his life outside of work, I knew he was in trouble. He had been arrested a couple of times but had never been prosecuted. He seemed to have some kind of influence behind him that was protecting him. And all those memories, those interactions that I had ignored, started to make sense. The investigation became more personal, and the pieces that once seemed like isolated fragments began to come together. Every clue, every piece of information gathered, pointed in one direction. Samuel Ramos was not just a former partner. He had been linked to the crime in some way. He had been part of that gang. Or at least, he had been someone close to them. But the scariest thing of all was what I discovered in the final hours of the investigation. Samuel was not only related to the victim, he himself was involved in a criminal network much bigger than I had imagined. And worst of all, something I could never forget, was the possibility that he himself was the killer. The case haunted me for years. The clues still didn't turn up, and the idea that someone so close to me was involved in something so dark got into my bones. I never saw him again, but I always knew that the echo of that rainy night would haunt me, trapping me in a cycle I could never break. The first envelope arrived one rainy afternoon, the kind where the city seemed to sink under a gray blanket, and the sound of the rain hitting the window glass was the only thing you could hear in my apartment. I didn't see it when I came home from work. I found it when I got to the dining room table, right next to my car keys, where I had never left any mail. No one had visited me that day. I hadn't received any calls or expected anything important, so I was a little surprised to find that envelope with no return address. It was an ordinary envelope, made of recycled paper, the kind you can find in any office supply store. What was strange was the fact that it had no markings, no address, and no postmark. Just a crumpled piece of paper, glued to its front, with my name handwritten in neat, precise handwriting, but which I didn't recognize. It didn't make sense. No one sent letters like that in the digital age. My first thought, irrationally, was that maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone had mistaken my address for someone else's. With a curiosity I hadn't anticipated, I tore open the envelope. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, carefully folded. I took it in my hands and unfolded it slowly, aware that the timing was odd, though I didn't know why. The contents were simple. A short paragraph describing a seemingly banal scene. What I had done that morning, what I had for breakfast, and how I had left the towel in the bathroom. The letter was unsigned. The tone was disturbing because I couldn't understand how anyone could know all those details. Each written word was a personal observation, nothing unusual by itself, but the totality of them all was beginning to disturb me. I had never mentioned those details to anyone. Even my ex-wife didn't know that much about my daily routines. I decided not to make a big deal out of it. Perhaps I thought it was a practical joke or some form of weird publicity. However, I couldn't get rid of the knot that formed in my stomach. 2 days passed, and in the early evening, another envelope arrived. This time I noticed it quickly, because it was right in front of the front door, as if someone had left it there at the last minute. I picked it up, and with a feeling I couldn't describe, took it to the table. I opened the envelope and found another letter, equally without return address. This time the contents were more precise. There was a reference to my visit to the grocery store, to the brands I had chosen for coffee and milk, something even I didn't remember doing. The language of the letter described each step of my routine in a precision that I found too chilling to be purely coincidental. The letter ended with a simple sentence: "I hope your day was as perfect as mine." A shiver ran down my spine. Something was wrong. The uncomfortable feeling turned to anxiety when I realized that not only did he know what I was doing, but he seemed to be following me. No one in my life knew so much about my habits. No one. Not even my best friend, with whom I shared long conversations about trivia, knew these details. Whoever was behind this had access to my life, to my most intimate movements. The letters kept coming. At first I felt helpless, a little confused, as if I were in the middle of an unfunny joke. But when the third letter arrived, I realized that these were no longer ordinary details. It described an evening when I had been at home, watching television. It said he had noticed how I settled on the couch, how the sound of the rain hit the window. In one small paragraph, the letter referred to a trivial comment I had made earlier that evening about a movie I watched on streaming, something I had only shared with my dog, while my mind wandered, not thinking that anyone might be listening. But the worst was when, in the letter of the fourth installment, I was mentioned the state of my bed, how I had left the sheet slightly messy in the bottom right corner, how I had forgotten to close the window in the bedroom, which had caused a bit of cold to come in through the slit. No one, absolutely no one, knew those details, and I hadn't even realized the window was open until I read that letter. Then the paranoia set in. Every time I left my house, I felt watched. It didn't matter if I went to work or to the store. There was something in the air, an invisible pressure following me. When I would return, I would find myself with the same feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the idea that someone was inside my house when I wasn't there. The letters, although they did not mention anything so direct, suggested a presence within the walls of my home. Every evening when I returned home, I would check everything, the doors, the windows, every little thing out of place. And of course, I found nothing. Nothing that could prove that anyone had been there. But the feeling remained. That's when I started hearing noises. Sometimes when I came in late at night, a creaking in the floorboards would stop me in my tracks. It seemed so real that I would stand still, waiting. My heart pounded, my hands sweated. But as I took a few more steps, the noise disappeared. It always disappeared before I could reach the source of the sound. And even though it was late, it was impossible to ignore it. One night, the rain was pouring down. The sound of the drops hitting the roof was the only thing that kept me somewhat calm, until something else came to my attention. A sound more subtle than the usual rustling. At first, it was nothing. A light tapping on the wall, as if something had been pushed against it. Then came the rustling. It wasn't a voice, but I felt it, like someone was nearby, breathing over my shoulder. I ran into the living room and checked all the doors, all the windows. Nothing was out of place, but the feeling was intensifying. I closed the lights, turned off the TV, and was completely silent. After a while, the noise stopped, but I couldn't sleep that night. The shadows in the room seemed to move, as if there was something more than darkness. I got up several times, checking every corner of my home, convinced that someone was there, lurking. The next day when I got home, the bedroom door was ajar. I hadn't left it that way. My heart skipped a beat, and my mind started racing. I knew what that meant. There was no way someone could have gotten in without me noticing. I decided it was time to investigate thoroughly. I went through my house with a flashlight, thoroughly checking every nook and cranny, every crevice, until I came to a small closet in the hallway. In the back of the closet, something glowed faintly in the gloom. Opening it, I found a small object I didn't recognize. An old cell phone, turned off, with a broken screen. It was tucked away in a box, next to one more letter. As I looked at it, I felt a wave of terror sweep through me. The letter said, "I've been watching you. Everything you do, I know. Everything." I couldn't take it anymore. I knew whoever was behind this had been inside my house, watching my every move. From that moment on, it no longer mattered whether I found physical evidence or not. Fear gripped me. I was no longer alone in my home. There was something else. Something dark. Someone in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to show me his true face. I had been stuck in this job for years. I was the kind of detective who specialized in missing persons, in those cases where clues were scarce and clues, if there were any, disappeared as fast as they appeared. There was always something obscure in each case, something that the media never covered in sufficient depth, something that, in the end, I never fully understood. That rainy night, it seemed no different than any other. The city seemed to swallow the sound of the storm, leaving only the incessant rumbling of thunder and the constant pounding of drops on the asphalt. The headlights of my car reflected in the water, creating a kind of liquid mirage that only heightened the sensation that someone, was watching me from the shadows. It wasn't the first time that feeling had come over me, and I was certain it wouldn't be the last. I had been following this case for months. The disappearance of Amanda Collins, a young woman who vanished without a trace in a seemingly safe neighborhood. No one knew anything. No one saw anything. As usual, small towns, the ones that seem quiet, are the most dangerous. People forget, clues go cold, and answers vanish into thin air. It was always like that, at least until I found the survivor. I got the call that night. A call as strange as the rain itself, which seemed to fall as if the whole world was crying for something it didn't even understand. On the other line of the call, a man, his voice slurred and shaky, told me something that chilled my blood. He mentioned Amanda's name. He said he knew her, that he had been with her, that she had been in that place, with him, for all that time. The survivor. He was alive. The Amanda Collins case, like so many others, had hit a dead end. It wasn't the first time a missing person had returned, but this case was different. The survivor was not a hero, not someone who escaped in a heroic flight. No, this man had lived with the kidnapper. He had been there, with him, in that very place that seemed like a hole in the world. I was tempted to give it all up right away, to give up, but my detective instinct compelled me to keep going. I needed answers. The place I was headed to was not on any map. It could hardly even be considered a town. It was more like some sort of forgotten slum, a corner of the country where people forget and news doesn't get through. The man who had called was a man named Ethan. He told me to wait for him in an old house at the end of the street. He said it was his refuge, a place where he finally felt safe. The rain had stopped slightly by the time I reached the site, but the air was thick, heavy, as if everything around me had absorbed the moisture. The house in front of me looked like a shadow, almost crumbling, a rickety wooden structure with broken windows and a door hanging off its hinges. A dead, lifeless house. Ethan was waiting for me on the porch. He was a man in his 30s, thin, with pale skin and sunken eyes, as if time had stood still for him. He was sitting in a wooden chair, staring into the void, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. When he saw me, he got up slowly, as if each movement cost him an enormous effort. However, it was the silence that scared me the most. He didn't utter a word when I approached. It was a while before we entered the house. He led me down a dark hallway, barely illuminated by the light coming through the cracks in the walls. As we went along, the musty smell grew thicker. It did not seem to be a place where a human being could live without losing his sanity. Silence pervaded everything, broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the dust accumulated on the floor. Finally, we came to a small room at the back. Ethan stopped and gestured for me to enter. Inside, the room was empty except for a rusted metal chair in the center. A couple of old blankets were strewn across the floor, as if an attempt had been made to create a makeshift bed. On a wooden table, a couple of personal objects of someone who had been there. An old notebook, a broken pen, a watch. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the walls could crush me at any moment. It was then that Ethan began to speak. His voice, broken, didn't seem to belong to him. He talked about their kidnapping, about how the man who had captured them, the same man who had held Amanda and so many other prisoners, had played with their minds. How he had manipulated every thought, every emotion, to turn them into more than just victims. He spoke of the lies, the empty promises, how the kidnapper had promised to free them, but never did. Ethan had been their companion, their observer, a forced bystander in a horror scenario. He had been part of the lie. What disturbed me most, however, was when he mentioned something I couldn't understand, the way Amanda had changed. As the days passed, she transformed. She became more than a victim. She became a part of the scenario, a character who had accepted her fate. Ethan said there was something dark in her eyes, something he could never forget, something that would haunt him forever. What I discovered that night was not just the story of a kidnapping, not just the story of a victim caught in the clutches of a monster. No, it was much darker than that. Ethan had witnessed something far worse, a process of dehumanization. What the kidnapper had accomplished was not only to imprison bodies, but to destroy people's very souls. And the most terrifying thing of all was that Amanda, despite having been freed, despite having escaped from that prison, never managed to regain what had been taken from her. When I finished listening to Ethan's story, I felt empty, as if an invisible weight was crushing my chest. I was exhausted, not from the walk, but from what I had just learned. But the worst was yet to come. At that moment, Ethan rose from the chair. His movements were slow, as if he was becoming aware of something deeper. And then, he told me, the name of the kidnapper. I knew him. He was someone who had been close to me for years, someone who had always been on the fringes of my investigations. The revelation of his identity hit me with the force of a train. Everything I thought I knew about the case crumbled before my eyes. I had been manipulated. The killer was much closer than I had ever imagined. And worst of all, he was now watching me, too. The rain had started again when I left the house, but I didn't care. I was soaked to the bone, but it wasn't the rain that chilled me. What chilled me was knowing that my life would never be the same again. That, like Amanda, I too had been caught in a web of lies, of betrayals, of dark secrets that I could now never forget. The rain was pounding hard against the windshield, reducing my visibility to a couple of meters in front of me. The windshield wiper was moving with a desperate rhythm, but it was useless. The water seemed to fall in endless sheets, as if the sky wanted to erase the city under its weight. I parked in front of the worn brick building I called an office, a space I shared with a musty smell and a desk covered with cluttered papers. I had been working on this case for weeks, but that night something had changed. I could feel it in the air, heavy and heavy, as if the rain was bringing more than water with it. The killer had left his mark all over the city, though never in an obvious way. His victims disappeared without a trace, but there was always something, a tiny detail, a coincidence impossible to ignore. In the last few weeks, he had abducted 4 people, all from different neighborhoods and walks of life. There was no apparent pattern, but each scene had its own mark. A black and white photograph left at the scene of the abduction, showing someone with their back turned standing in the rain. My last find was enough for the case to begin to take shape. I had found a connection between the victims. They had all been photographed days before their disappearance, always in public places and always unnoticed. He was a hunter, stalking his prey with methodical precision. The idea that someone could be so close undetected was nerve-wracking, but it also ignited something inside me, a need to find out who was behind this, to stop him before he took another life. That night, I received a manila envelope slipped under my office door. It was strange. I wasn't expecting clients or messages. Opening it, I found a series of photographs. They were of me. The pictures showed me at different times in the last few days, walking down the street, walking into a cafe, looking into a window. The last place looked familiar. It was the park I used to visit to clear my mind. My skin prickled as I recognized someone's shadow in the background of one of the photos. Someone had been watching me. I decided to go to the park that evening. The rain hadn't let up, but I couldn't wait. I felt I was getting closer and closer to something, although I couldn't tell if it was the answer or the danger. I arrived at the park shortly before midnight. The streetlights were flickering, casting shaky shadows on the wet ground. Water formed puddles on the gravel paths, and the sound of my footsteps mingled with the steady drip of sodden leaves. I walked to the bench I recognized in the photo. Nothing seemed out of place, but my instinct told me I was not alone. I looked around, searching for any sign of movement, any sign that someone was watching me. Then I saw it. On the ground, near the bench, was something glowing faintly under the light of a street lamp. I bent down to pick it up and discovered it was another photograph. This time, the picture showed the bench from a greater distance, but what made me shiver was the figure sitting on it. Me. A sound behind me broke the silence, a rustling of branches that gave me goosebumps. I turned quickly, but no one was there. My heart pounded as I backed toward the bench, trying to stay calm. I knew I should leave, but something told me that if I left, I would lose my only chance to catch the killer. I decided to follow the path into the darker part of the park. The rain was heavier here, and the tree branches formed a canopy that barely let any light through. I advanced cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the path ahead of me. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should, as if the forest was amplifying my presence. Then I saw it. At the end of the trail, there was a small cabin I didn't remember seeing before. The structure was old, with weathered wooden walls and windows covered by broken boards. From inside, a flickering light escaped through the cracks, casting shadows that moved as if they had a life of their own. I approached slowly, my body tense, every muscle prepared for the worst. The door was ajar, and the smell emanating from inside was nauseating. A mixture of dampness, metal, and something I couldn't identify but that turned my stomach. I stepped inside, holding my flashlight in front of me. The interior was small and cluttered, with broken furniture and papers strewn across the floor. But what really captured my attention was the back wall. It was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, all showing different people, all in the rain. I recognized the victims, but I also saw other faces, some I hadn't seen before, and some I had. My own face was among them. There was something else. In the center of the room there was a table covered with rusty tools, knives, saws, and something that appeared to be a modified hammer. An old camera rested on a tripod, pointed toward a chair in the corner. My mind was racing trying to process what I was seeing when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Slowly I turned, and there he was. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in a soaked trench coat that dripped to the floor. His face was hidden by a grotesque mask, made of worn leather, with rudimentary openings for eyes and mouth. In his hand, he held a long knife that reflected the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. He said nothing, just stood there, watching me. The tension in the air was palpable, as if time had stopped. I backed away slowly, trying to calculate my options. There was no way out behind me, and I knew I couldn't outrun him in those conditions. My only chance was to face him. I grabbed one of the tools from the table, a heavy screwdriver, and prepared for the inevitable. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Each blow and dodge seemed to take forever, but in reality, it all must have happened in a matter of minutes. I managed to wound him in the arm, and his knife fell to the ground with a metallic sound. I took the opportunity to push him into the wall, where he hit his head and fell to the ground, motionless. My breathing was erratic as I watched him, making sure he didn't move. With trembling hands, I ripped the mask from his face, and what I saw transfixed me. It was a familiar face. The killer was someone I knew, someone I would never have suspected. He was my neighbor, a kind and reserved man with whom I had shared many casual conversations in the past. The horror of the revelation hit me like a wave. Everything I thought I knew about this case, about the people around me, crumbled at that moment. I didn't know what to do. I staggered out of the cabin, leaving the man unconscious on the floor. The rain kept falling, washing the blood from my hands as I made my way back to town. That night, I delivered the evidence to the police, along with a detailed confession of what I had found. I didn't know if they would believe me, but I knew I couldn't carry this alone. As I walked back to my office in the rain, a strange feeling settled in my chest. Even though I had discovered the killer, I felt that the case was not really closed. There was something else, something I still didn't understand. And then I saw it. Reflected in my office window, a familiar figure stood on the sidewalk in the rain, watching me. His face was covered by a different mask, but I knew it was him. The hunter was not finished, and now I was his prey. The rain fell relentlessly, soaking the empty city streets as I watched from my apartment window. The drops slid down the glass, distorting the distant lights as if they were memories crumbling in my mind. A letter had arrived that morning, one I hadn't expected, with no return address or stamps to indicate its origin. The envelope was made of a rough, yellowed paper, and inside was only a sheet with a few handwritten lines. It said my name, my real name, the one I hadn't used for years. It said that I was remembered, that we had shared a childhood in that small town that I had tried so hard to forget. And the most disturbing thing, it mentioned the dark days, the disappearances, the screams that no one else seemed to have heard. They said they remembered everything, even things I myself had buried deep in my memory. At first I thought it was a joke. I had left that place so long ago that I could hardly imagine anyone tracking me down after all this time. But something about the handwriting, the way the words seemed to carry a personal weight, made me uneasy. I left the letter on the table and tried to get it out of my head, but the feeling that something was watching me, even in the safety of my apartment, wouldn't leave me alone. That night the dreams returned. I hadn't had nightmares about my childhood in years, but there they were, as vivid as ever. The faces of the missing children, the nights of searching with flashlights that never found anything, and the forest, always the forest, with its branches twisted like claws and the whisper of something other than the wind. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of the rain against the window amplifying my unease. The second letter arrived 2 days later. This time it was more direct, more personal. It described me as the silent child who never participated, who watched from the shadows while the others played. He said they remembered how I looked out into the woods, as if I knew something the others did not. And he would end with a question. Why didn't you ever tell the others what you saw that night? That line sparked something in my mind, a memory I had tried to forget. I was 11 years old the first time someone disappeared. It was a girl named Clara, one of the brightest and most beloved in our class. I remember the hysteria that broke out in the town, the parents who wouldn't let their children leave the house, the church meetings where everyone prayed for her return. But what no one knew was that I had seen her go into the woods the night she disappeared. I had said nothing. Fear had paralyzed me. I had heard her voice calling me from the street. I had left the house to see her, and I had watched her go into the trees as if something was guiding her. I didn't follow her, and the next day, when the adults started asking questions, I lied. I said I hadn't seen her. That lie had haunted me for years, but I had never talked about it with anyone. How could that letter know? I decided to investigate. I went through old boxes I had tucked away in the corner of my closet, filled with mementos from my childhood. Among them I found an album with newspaper clippings of the disappearances. Clara was the first, but not the last. In the years that followed, 3 other people disappeared, all around the forest. The clippings offered no answers, only more questions, and the memory of those days became sharper with each turning page. The third letter arrived a week later. I found it not in the mailbox, but on the floor in front of my door, as if someone had personally left it there. This time, the tone was different. It said that the time had come to face the truth, to remember what really happened. There was a place indicated, an address I recognized immediately. It was my childhood home, the same one my family had abandoned when we moved after the last incidents. It said I should go there at nightfall, and I would find what I was looking for. The thought of returning to that place filled me with an inexplicable dread, but I also felt an attraction that I could not ignore. The rain was still falling as I took the train into town. Everything was as I remembered it, but also different, smaller, more faded. The streets were deserted, the windows closed, as if the place was trapped in an eternal lethargy. I arrived at the old house as it was beginning to get dark. It was exactly as I remembered it. The shutters broken, the paint peeling, the garden overrun with weeds. The sound of rain against the roof was a familiar echo, but the place had a different air, heavier, darker. The door opened with a creak that echoed in the void. Inside, Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs. The lantern I had brought illuminated the empty rooms, every corner filled with the ghosts of my past. The smell of mold and old wood was overpowering, but something drove me on, up the stairs to my old room. There, on the floor, I found a box I didn't remember leaving. Inside the box was a notebook, one that belonged to Clara. I recognized her handwriting immediately, the scribbles she used to make in the margins. The pages were filled with notes, drawings of the forest, and words that seemed more desperate as they went on. There was a phrase repeated several times. "They are not dead. They are here." And at the end, a drawing that chilled my blood. A tall, dark figure with empty eyes and arms as long as branches. The sound of footsteps on the first floor brought me out of my reverie. At first I thought it was the wind, but the footsteps were too rhythmic, too human. I descended the stairs with my heart pounding, my flashlight trembling in my hand. There was no one there, but the front door, which I had locked on my way in, was now wide open. Outside, the rain was falling harder, and the forest, visible through the broken window, seemed darker than ever. I felt an inexplicable attraction to the trees, as if something was calling me from there. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a need. With the notebook in one hand and the flashlight in the other, I walked deeper into the forest. Each step seemed to take me further away from reality, the sound of the rain muffled by the whisper of the wind through the branches. I don't know how long I walked before I found it. It was a clearing, one I didn't remember seeing before. In the center was a sort of makeshift altar, made of stones and branches, covered with carved symbols I didn't recognize. And there, on the altar, was something he could not understand. A humanoid figure, motionless, covered with moss and leaves, as if it had been there for years. But the most disturbing thing was the eyes. They were open and seemed to look directly at me, full of something that was not life, but not death either. The sound of footsteps behind me made me turn, but there was no one there. The air grew heavier, and suddenly I felt that I was not alone. A presence, something beyond my comprehension, was becoming more and more palpable. It was then that I understood. Clara, the other children, had not disappeared. They were here, trapped in something the forest had claimed, something that could not be explained. As I tried to back away, the shadows seemed to lengthen, enveloping me in a darkness that was unnatural. I heard whispers, voices I didn't recognize but that seemed to come from everywhere. My flashlight flickered and then went out, leaving me alone in the gloom. The last thing I remember before I lost consciousness was the figure on the altar, moving slowly, as if awakening. I woke up at dawn, soaked and covered in mud, back in the village. I didn't remember how I had gotten there, but the notebook was still in my hands. Since then, the letters stopped coming, but the dreams don't stop. In them, I am always in the forest. I always hear their voices. I don't know if I'll ever escape what I saw that night, but one thing is for sure. The past never disappears. It just waits in the shadows until you're ready to face it. The rain was the only thing that accompanied me that night. It was pounding hard on the glass of my office window, as if the storm was trying to overflow to undo everything. Since I received the news of my father's death, the hours seemed to dilate, to stagnate in a time that did not move forward. The same rain had fallen the day they called to warn me, and that rain, which now seemed heavier than ever, brought me back to the darkest memories of my childhood, to everything I had tried to forget. My father was no ordinary man. He had never been. For years I saw him as a distant figure, a man who stood apart, almost as if he were hiding in his own life. He wasn't cruel or abusive, but there was something about him that had always disturbed me, something I couldn't identify. It was as if he had a part of him, a shadow, that he didn't want to share with anyone, not even me. And yet I was never suspicious enough to wonder what was in that hidden part of his life. When my father passed away, The news came as a sharp blow, as if life itself had thrown a stone in my face. His death was not unexpected, but what happened next was. In the days that followed, I began going through his belongings, looking for any clues that would help me understand who he had really been. I didn't expect to find anything in particular, just fuzzy memories and forgotten papers. But what I found made me shudder. It led me to a truth I would never have imagined. It was a letter, handwritten, lying on his desk at the bottom of a drawer. The letter was addressed to someone I had never heard mentioned, not even in his last words. The sender told me nothing, but my father's words in that letter were unmistakable. He spoke of a life commitment, of renewal and transcendence. He mentioned rituals, groups, and secret covenants. The words were filled with a conviction that I didn't understand, but which, as I read, felt like a weight crushing my chest. I knew something didn't fit, but I couldn't stop reading. The letter spoke of a cult, a secret brotherhood to which my father had belonged, a cult that performed rituals in secluded places under total darkness, where the rules of society did not exist. The cult promised a kind of power that was not visible to the naked eye, but that was deeply felt in the soul of the one who lived it. It spoke of sacrifices, of transformations, of a life beyond what any human being could imagine. And worst of all, my father had been part of it until the end of his days. With my heart racing, I began to investigate. I didn't even know where to start. I had no idea what I was looking for. I just felt a pressure, a compelling need to understand what had happened in the last years of his life. The letter was not the only clue. I found more documents, small details that my father had left behind, as if he knew that someday someone would look for the answers. Everything seemed to be designed to lead me down a dark, winding path. The first thing I discovered was a name, the Guardian. I didn't know who he was, but he seemed to be a key figure within this cult. As I investigated, the name appeared again and again, like a shadow on every clue I found. There was something unsettling about how the cult members referred to him, something reverential, as if they feared the name as much as they revered it. The connection to my father was clear, but I didn't understand how they had gotten involved, how someone like him, someone who seemed so oblivious to this sort of thing, had fallen under the influence of such a group. It was days before I finally found an address. It was a house on the outskirts of town, isolated, hidden among trees. I had no logical reason to go, but I couldn't let it go. Something was pushing me to do it, something I felt deep inside me, like a kind of calling. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe just the need to find an answer. I didn't know. The drive there was long. As I drove down the wet road, the trees seemed to close in around me, creating a wall that surrounded me at all times. The rain didn't stop, it only increased, and as I got closer to that house, my anxiety transformed into palpable fear. The air was thick, as if the weather had changed the very instant I made the decision to go. When I reached the house, I stopped in front of the entrance, but I could do nothing but look. There were no lights, no sounds. Everything was immersed in an ominous stillness. It was as if I was entering a place where I wasn't supposed to be, a space outside of reality. Finally, I got out of the car. Footsteps on the wet ground echoed in the silence of the night. Each of those steps seemed like the last one, as if something was waiting for me at the end of the road. When I reached the door, I pushed it without thinking. The house was empty, silent. There was no one on the first floor, but I felt a presence, something watching me from the darkness. I cautiously climbed the stairs, my heart pounding in my throat, until I reached a room at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar. It was what I saw inside that made me finally understand the magnitude of it all. In the center of the room, there was an altar, covered with strange symbols and writings I didn't understand. A portrait of my father hung on the wall, and what appeared to be an old photograph from his youth was on a table next to a slowly burning candle. The image of his face, the same one I had always known, was marked with something else. something I couldn't recognize. And then, I knew. The Guardian. That figure I had searched for so long. It was there, in the photo, somehow represented in my father's gaze. It had been inside his life, inside his soul. What I didn't understand then, but began to understand with terror, was that I was part of it too. Something had marked me without my knowing it. Something darker than death itself. And now, the cult had found me. I left the house with the feeling that my life was no longer my own. That everything I had thought I had known had been an illusion. The cold air, the rain, the car. Nothing was enough to drown out the feeling that I was being watched, that I was being pursued by something I couldn't understand. But I knew I couldn't run away. My father's revelation had marked me, and like him, I would soon become a target. The rain was still falling mercilessly, but now it seemed to be carrying something much darker than the storm, something I could no longer avoid. The rain never stopped falling in that city, as if the sky was trying to wash away the sins of all those who walked under its gray cloak. The sound of the water hitting the windows of my apartment was a constant accompaniment, almost deafening, but I'd gotten used to it. Somehow, it helped distract me, to forget everything I had been through, everything I had done. The past is never forgotten, no matter how many years have passed. I was a man who had paid for his mistakes. 10 long years, one after another, of prisons and cells, of internal struggles and memories that dragged like shadows. I was not a family man, not a good man, and I never was. Crime was my life, my world, until the system threw me out. The sentence was served, but the punishment never stopped. Society does not forget, least of all those who are trapped in their own past. At first, upon leaving the prison, the city seemed different to me. I was not used to seeing the world so free, so full of possibilities. I wanted to start over. I tried to do it, I really did. I found work in a small car repair shop. The people there didn't know me, or at least they didn't know who I really was. No one looked at me with suspicion. At first, everything seemed to be going well. Maybe it wasn't a perfect life, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But calm doesn't last forever. Peace has a strange way of slipping away when the past haunts you, and I knew that. The problem was, I had never expected it to do so soon. It all started with a crime. A murder that happened in the neighborhood, just a few blocks from where I lived. What seemed to be a simple case of a fight gone bad was getting stranger and stranger. The details coincided too much with what I had done in the past, with the mistakes I had made, with the things I had left behind, the shadows that still haunted me. The murder had nothing to do with me, I knew, but the way it had been carried out, the traces, the kind of violence, it seemed so familiar, as if I was watching a scene from my own past life. I began to wonder if people were watching me, if they were linking me to the crime. In every corner, in every furtive glance, I felt the weight of suspicion. I knew it could be anyone else, but deep down, something inside me told me it wasn't that simple. Something inside me was screaming at me that I was being watched, that my past hadn't let me go. I had felt it before, but this time it was different. Paranoia was taking hold of me. The police began to investigate. At first, no one mentioned me. But rumors began to circulate, and as always happens in these situations, rumors have a way of getting bigger and more damaging with each repetition. People started talking, to whisper on street corners, to look in my direction as I passed. It was no longer just a suspicion. It was a certainty in their eyes. The ex-convict, the guy coming from jail. Everyone knew what he was capable of. Every time someone looked at me that way, every time I heard my name on the radio or in a conversation between strangers, I felt the weight of the lie building over my life. The memory of my years in prison, the conviction that marked me more than the physical scars, all came back to my mind with force. The traces of my past would not fade, no matter how hard I tried to hide them. And now it seemed that the same traces were being used to bind me to something I had not done. The nights grew longer. The rain never stopped falling, and the drops, hitting hard on my window panes, were the only sound I could hear. Everything felt like an invisible prison. The outside world was beyond my reach, and I could only wait, looking through the drops of water running down the glass. I felt as if the weight of the city was on my shoulders, a city that already knew me, a city that had not forgotten me. One afternoon, after an exhausting day at the workshop, I lingered in the small kitchen of my apartment, drinking a beer. I knew things weren't right, but I didn't know how to stop them. I had earned the distrust of the few friends I had managed to make. People didn't talk to me the same way anymore, and customers from the shop were starting to disappear. No one wanted the ex-convict to fix their cars, even if he had nothing to do with what happened. No one wanted to come near me. That's when I got the call. A man, unknown to me, spoke to me in a low voice. His tone of voice was cold, calculating. He told me that he knew what had happened, that he knew what I had done, and that if I didn't do what he said, the consequences would be severe. I could not understand how anyone could know so well about my past. It was impossible. No one knew what had happened in those dark years. No one but me. Or so I thought. The voice on the call offered me no explanations, only threats. It asked me to go to the place where it had all started, the warehouse that had been my refuge in times of crime. At first, I didn't know what to do. How could anyone know about me? About my life? In such detail? My heart was pounding in my chest and paranoia gripped me. Everything I had tried to leave behind was now catching up with me, and I could no longer hide from it. I went to the warehouse, as I had been instructed. Rain lashed the city, and the streets were empty, as if everyone had disappeared, as if the city itself had ceased to exist. When I arrived, the door was ajar. I knew I had to go in, that I had no choice. The air was heavy, thick, as if time had stopped there. Every step I took echoed off the walls of the old warehouse, and the echo gave me back a claustrophobic feeling that made me feel even more trapped. Inside, there was nothing waiting for me. No one was there. However, the lights were flickering, and the place was completely silent, as if something was about to happen. I approached slowly, my footsteps reverberating in the void. Then what I saw shocked me. On the ground, a lifeless figure lay motionless. The face was covered, but I didn't need to see any more to know it was a corpse. And there, in that darkness, with the rain hammering the rusted structure of the building, I understood the worst. The voice, the threats, the corpse. It was all part of a macabre game. I was involved in something much bigger, something that was dragging me back into the abyss. I was no longer just an ex-convict. I was no longer just the man who had paid for his sins. I was now the prime suspect in a crime I had not committed, but which the evidence seemed to indicate otherwise. The past never goes away. No matter how many years go by, no matter how far you try to go. The shadow of the past will always catch up with you, and maybe, just maybe, it will drag you back into that dark abyss from which you never managed to escape. And I, now trapped in this new nightmare, knew that the fight for my innocence would be my last battle. I didn't know if I would get out of it alive, but it was clear that somehow the chains of my past had caught up with me once again. The sound of the rain hitting the window accompanied me throughout the day, like a backdrop in my mind. My grandmother's house, now empty, had become a place of broken memories and distant echoes. The last time I saw her, she was too old, too frail. She passed away a few days ago, and now, as part of my job, I had to clean and tidy her house. My mother asked me to take care of it, to go through all her belongings, and to get rid of what was no longer useful. Those were her exact words. Just take away what is no longer useful. Despite the sadness of the situation, I was somewhat relieved that finally, after years, Grandma's house was empty. As a child, I used to feel uncomfortable in this place. There was something in the air, something heavy and dense, that made my nights at my grandmother's house endless. The old house was full of dark corners, hallways that never seemed to end, and a constant sense of unease, as if the house itself was aware of our presence. However, as I wandered the halls, cleaning up what was left, I came across something I hadn't expected. In an old box, hidden behind some things in a closet, I found a stack of photos. They were wrapped in a piece of sagging, dirty cloth, but despite their aged appearance, the images seemed intact. Curious, I unfolded them, hoping to find family mementos, perhaps of my mother or some distant relative. But that's not what I found. The photos were of people I didn't recognize, individuals with serious faces, empty stares, standing in unfamiliar places. They seemed to be casual shots, not posed, as if someone had taken them without the people noticing. Some of the images showed people walking down dark streets, others in lonely parks, and still others, even more disturbing, showed anonymous faces of people standing in what appeared to be dark rooms. All the images, without exception, radiated a strange feeling, something unsettling, something that made me shudder. At first, I didn't think much of them. I thought maybe they were pictures of my grandmother's friends or acquaintances I no longer remembered. But as time went on and my mind processed what I had seen, something began to bother me. The people in the photos had something strange in their gaze, something I couldn't identify, as if they were aware of something I didn't understand, as if the observers were not simply passive subjects in front of the camera, but were aware of something sinister behind the photo. I decided to do a little more research on these people. I searched the internet, looked through old newspapers, and asked acquaintances, but I couldn't find any clues. The faces of those people were still unknown, and they didn't seem to exist anywhere. Still, the feeling that there was something else behind those photos did not leave me calm, an uneasiness that grew more and more with each photo I saw. It was when I began to see patterns in those images that things took a strange turn. Some of the people in the photos, who at first seemed to be oblivious to anything relevant, suddenly disappeared. I could find no trace of them anywhere. Their names did not appear on the internet, and the memories of people who knew my grandmother did not mention these individuals. But most disturbing of all, the details in the photos began to stand out more. Some of the images that initially seemed casual to me were beginning to show something much more disturbing, a presence in the background. I hadn't noticed it at first, but now that I looked more closely, I could make out blurry figures, people who were not visible at first, but now seemed to be moving in the shadows. Each time I spent more time with these photos, the sense that something was wrong became more palpable. My grandmother's behavior had always been strange, but I had never imagined her engaging in anything like this. Why had she kept those photos? Why had she kept them hidden from everyone, even her own family? The very idea that my grandmother had been involved in something dark, something so shady, was something I had a hard time processing. But as I continued to investigate, I discovered that some of the people in the photos had disappeared without a trace. In a couple of cases, the disappearances coincided with dates close to when my grandmother had lived in the house. What began as a simple curiosity turned into a dangerous obsession. One day, while examining one of the older photos, I noticed something that chilled my blood. In the background of the image, among the crowd of people who seemed to be strolling down a street, there was a figure that stood out. A man standing in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the camera. His face was not fully visible, but his gaze was riveted on the lens, looking directly into the camera. And worst of all, he seemed to be looking directly at me. I don't know how I knew, but something in that image told me that this look was not casual. That person wasn't just posing for a picture. It wasn't an image taken by just any photographer. It was as if someone was watching my every move, as if he knew exactly what I was doing, and as if that picture had been taken for the sole purpose of trapping me. of luring me into something. I decided to go to the police, but when I talked to them about the disappearances I had encountered, they were skeptical. It wasn't the first time someone had approached me with strange stories about photos and disappearances. They tried to reassure me, to tell me that I might be exaggerating, but something inside me told me I was right. Those photos had a connection, something much deeper than I could understand at the time. That's when things started to escalate. I started getting strange phone calls, always at times when the rain was pounding harder against the windows. No one on the other end of the line was talking, but I could hear breathing, whispering, and occasionally, muffled laughter. On several occasions, I noticed that someone had come into my house, moving things around, leaving small traces of dirt on the floor, as if they were making sure I noticed. But I saw no one, no trace of that presence. It wasn't long before I understood that I was not only being chased by the truth, but that I was being watched by something far more dangerous. The figures I had seen in the photos seemed to be following me, and with each passing day, I felt more trapped. My life became a nightmare. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling that someone was watching me, as if the people in those photos were always behind me, waiting for me. Visits to the police were useless. No one seemed to believe me. No one was willing to listen. Meanwhile, the disappearances became more frequent, closer, and fear settled in my chest with every step I took. I knew there was something much darker behind the photos, something my grandmother had tried to hide, something I could no longer ignore. One day, I found one more photo. This photo was different from all the others. In it, at the edge of the picture, was the same figure I had seen before, the man with his eyes fixed on the camera. And this time, he was not alone. There were more people around him, and they were all looking directly at the camera, with an intensity that made me shiver. At the bottom of the photo, in handwriting, was a date, the date of the disappearance of a person I knew. And below that date, there was a simple word: next. I knew at that moment that the people in those photos were not just strangers. They were not victims of a random crime. I was being hunted, and I was next. The rain was relentless that afternoon. It pounded the glass of my window hard, covering everything with a layer of water that seemed to blur the boundaries between the inside and outside of my house. The sound of the storm was seeping through the cracks, as if the whole world was taking a breath, waiting for something. And in that silence broken by the rain, I found myself once again staring at the phone in my hands, feeling the weight of the memory crushing me. My younger brother Eduardo had been missing for 2 weeks. 2 weeks that seemed endless, filled with despair, uncertainty, and a deep emptiness that I could not fill with any of the words the police offered me. 2 weeks since I had heard nothing from him, since I had received no message, no sign, no trace. And now, as I sat here in our childhood home, I felt like I was the last of the survivors, trapped in a story I should never have known. I remember the call I received from the police. At first I thought it was a mistake, that maybe someone had confused his name, or that it was a misunderstanding. But when they told me there were signs that Eduardo was involved in something much darker than I had imagined, everything changed. I couldn't process what I was being told. My brother was young, just finishing college, and he never showed any signs of being involved in anything out of the ordinary. He was always a quiet kid, quiet at times, but with a normal life, right? That's what I thought, until I started looking for answers on my own. The police, of course, had already begun the investigation, but what I found stunned me. Every path they took ended in closed doors, empty records, and contradictory testimony. No one had seen or heard anything, or at least they didn't want to say anything, as if something or someone was interfering. I couldn't just stand there with my arms folded, waiting. I knew I had to do something, though I had no idea where to start. So, with a mixture of anger and despair, I decided I had to go back to the family home. It was a place full of memories, but it was also the starting point for many of the questions that now plagued me. Perhaps there, in the rooms we shared as children, I could find something that would explain my brother's disappearance. Something the police had missed, something that had been hidden beneath the surface. The house was exactly as I remembered it. Dirty, dusty, but familiar, as if time had stopped moving since we left. The rain was still coming down hard outside, pounding on the roof and floor, as if the weather itself was mimicking my despair. The front door was ajar, and as I entered, I was greeted by the musty air of years of neglect. I was unprepared for what I would find. My mind was not yet ready to face the shadows that lurked in the darkest corners of our family. My first instinct was to check Eduardo's room. The door, which used to be open frequently, was now closed. When I opened it, the smell of dust and dampness invaded me, but what made me stop was not the bad smell, but what I saw on the table. A pile of messy papers, old photographs, and among them, something that looked like a notebook. I took it in my hands carefully, and when I opened it, I knew that my worst fears were about to be confirmed. The notebook was Eduardo's, no doubt about it. His handwriting, his scribbles on the corners of the pages, everything was there. But what he wrote was anything but normal. There were fragments of his daily life, what appeared to be a diary of sorts, but as he went on, the stories became stranger, darker. He mentioned people I didn't know, places we had never visited, and what chilled my blood the most were references to a secret job, to forbidden information, and, what left me completely confused, a mention of something called the family. In the days that followed, Eduardo began to distance himself from everyone, to avoid our calls, to change his behavior. I thought maybe he was going through a phase, maybe he was worried about the future, or a relationship, but the words in that notebook told me otherwise. Something else was going on, something far more sinister than I ever imagined. As I reviewed the photos, I noticed something even more disturbing. One of the images showed Eduardo with a group of people, some of whom I knew, and some of whom I didn't recognize at all. They were together, seated at a table, in what looked like some sort of meeting. Eduardo's face was distorted by something, by a fear or discomfort that I could not decipher. As I looked closer, a sense of uneasiness grew in my chest. Among those people, there was a man who looked vaguely familiar, though I didn't know why. I continued to investigate, looking for more clues, something that might lead me to the truth, but all I could find were more questions. In every corner of the house, in every object I touched, it seemed as if something was lurking, as if the walls themselves knew I was looking for something. The rain continued its rumbling outside, and with every drop that fell, I felt time slipping away. It wasn't until I started checking the basement of the house that I found something truly disturbing. In an old wooden box there was a series of letters. At first I thought they were unimportant things, but when I opened them, I realized they contained information about missing persons. They were police reports, newspaper clippings, and some notes detailing unfinished investigations. Among those letters, I found something that took my breath away. A name, the same man I had seen in the photos with Eduardo. It was impossible that he was not involved. The man in question had been investigated for several crimes in the past, but had always managed to evade justice. Not only that, but his name was associated with a criminal network operating in the city, something I had never heard of before. Eduardo had been investigating these people. Why? What had led him to get involved in something so dangerous? As I realized what this meant, a sense of dread ran down my spine. Eduardo's disappearance was no accident. It wasn't just another case of someone going missing. My brother had been pulled into something much bigger, something much darker. And now, for some reason, I found myself in the middle of that web, chasing the shadows he had left behind. That night, as the wind and rain lashed the house, I felt more alone than ever. The answers I had found only opened up more questions, and the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows intensified with each passing minute. I had no idea what had happened to Eduardo, but one thing was clear. My brother had not disappeared alone. He had been part of something bigger, something that now haunted me. The rain never stopped falling that night, and I kept searching, knowing that the answers I found only led me deeper into an abyss from which I could no longer escape. The shadows we had tried to hide, the shadows of our own family, could no longer be ignored. And now, somehow, I too was part of that darkness. The rain was falling steadily that night, and the sound of the drops hitting the roof of my car seemed to echo my thoughts, which teetered between clarity and confusion. I had grown accustomed to the solitude of the rain. It had always been an ally in my moments of introspection, a cloak that hid me from memories I didn't want to face. But on this night, the rain offered me no solace. I felt more exposed than ever. The man I was chasing, the criminal who had made me change my life, seemed to always be one step ahead. No matter what I did, how I moved or how careful I was, he was there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to end my hunt. Before all this, I was a cop. For years, my life was marked by law and order, or so people told me. I was part of an elite team, the kind of guy who could solve any case, any crime. But everything changed the night I made the wrong decision. It wasn't the first time I made mistakes, but that was the one that sunk me. It was a case of corruption in the department. When things got ugly, I was forced to leave, to step back and disappear. The police fired me and my life took a 180-degree turn. I had no choice but to start over. That's when I decided to become a bounty hunter. Life was simpler on that side of the law, or so I thought. The change was brutal, but something in me needed the adrenaline, the hunt. I knew my skills would not be wasted chasing fugitives, people who had done terrible things, but still had a price on their heads. The justice wasn't the same, but the reward was always enough to get me up every morning. However, it was in a recent case when it all spun out of control. The man I was after was no mere criminal. He was a cunning creature, a man who had managed to evade the hands of the law time and time again, always leaving false trails, clues that led to nothing. He had killed and robbed, but not in a predictable way. Every time I thought I had him, he vanished like fog, always 2 steps ahead. I first heard of him when I was offered his hunt. He was a man of few words, a common-sounding name, but whose actions never were. No one really knew where he came from, but his crimes left no room for doubt. He tortured his victims, made them disappear, and then killed them, always leaving a signature, a pattern. There were things they didn't tell me at first, things they'd rather I didn't know, but it only took me a few quick searches to realize what I was hunting. There was a feeling in the air that night, something I couldn't ignore. I knew he was nearby, lurking from somewhere in the darkness. My car moved slowly forward, headlights illuminating only the nearest road, the fog thickening as the rain lashed down hard. I knew I was in the right neighborhood. I knew the answers to my questions, the answers that had been eluding me, were about to appear. The chase had begun weeks before, but at that moment, everything had changed. The man, who had made so many people disappear, had now been listed as the prime suspect in a series of new murders. I had been hired to track his movements, but I soon realized that I wasn't just after him for the money. Something inside me, something dark that I had never noticed before, was driving me to follow him. I wanted to catch him. I wanted to see the desperation in his eyes when he finally realized he could no longer escape. Something about his story connected with me in a haunting way. Perhaps it was the fact that in my previous life as a cop, I had been like him, someone who operated in the shadows, doing things I shouldn't have. Perhaps that was the reason I was so caught in his web. That night, the empty, wet streets seemed like a maze of possibilities. The information I had gathered over the days had led me to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place where the silence spoke volumes. I knew he was there, hidden in the shadows, waiting, like a hunting animal. The place seemed tailor-made for him, hidden, secluded, with multiple entrances and exits. The warehouse was surrounded by high walls, dirty, abandoned, and full of narrow, convoluted corridors. A perfect place for someone who knew how to disappear. Upon entering, the tension could be cut with a knife. Every step echoed on the damp floor, echoing throughout the empty building. The sound of the rain hitting the roof was the only thing I could hear besides my breathing. I moved forward cautiously, knowing that any false move could be my last. Suddenly, something in the air changed. The atmosphere became thicker. The humidity seemed to envelop me, as if I was being pulled into something darker. It wasn't until I reached the back of the warehouse that I saw the footprints. A series of marks, small but definite, on the floor. He was here. No matter how fast or stealthy he was, he had left his tracks. And as I moved on, I realized something. The footprints weren't just those of a man. There was something else. Something I couldn't immediately identify. Suddenly, the light from my flashlight illuminated a wall, and there, on it, a message was etched in what appeared to be blood. It was brief, direct, and above all, disturbing. It said, "You are close." I realized what had happened. I had gotten too close, and the game had changed. I quickened my pace, now knowing that there was no time left. The chase had reached its peak, and the criminal, now more cunning than ever, was playing his last card. I knew the place was full of traps, of deception, and I could not afford to fall into them. However, the feeling of being watched intensified. From one moment to the next, I felt that I was being followed, that someone was behind me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tension enveloped me, and the rain falling so heavily outside only added to the feeling of being trapped. Suddenly, a shadow slipped in front of me, almost imperceptible, and my instinct forced me to raise my gun. But as I turned the corner, I realized something I never imagined. The hunter was now the prey. He had achieved what he had always wanted, and I was just another pawn in his macabre game. I was at a crossroads. I had come too far to turn back. But I also knew that the only way to win would be to keep going, to confront him on his own ground, in the darkness he knew so well. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, and at that moment, I knew that the hunt would not end until one of us fell. The rain was hitting the windshield of my car hard, drawing blurred lines that dissolved instantly, like memories that never consolidated. The noise of the water falling on the metal was deafening, and for a moment, I felt that the world was reduced to that monotonous melody, to that feeling of isolation. I was back in the city I had left behind years ago, not by choice, but by necessity. Sometimes the past finds us in the most unexpected way, and there is nothing we can do about it. I had returned to attend to a work matter, or so I told myself. But when fate crosses paths with people we once knew, excuses disappear, and the truth hits us full force. Like that night when everything changed. I was driving through the soggy city streets, looking for a quiet place to stay, when I saw him. On the sidewalk, under the flickering light of a streetlight, someone beckoned to me. At first I didn't recognize him. Time, distance, and the scars that life leaves behind make us forget details. But as I got closer, his face began to take shape. It was him, Lucas. An old college friend, someone with whom I had shared many stories, laughs and drunken nights. We hadn't spoken in years, but without knowing why, I felt a strange mixture of relief and distrust as I saw his figure in the gloom. I picked up my pace slightly and slowed down in front of him. The rain was soaking him, and his face, though familiar, looked strange. People change over time, but there was something else in his gaze, something I couldn't identify. I didn't have time to greet him. As soon as he got into the car, his voice was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't how I remembered Lucas. The anger in his tone, that desperation seeping through his words, unnerved me. But before I could react, he had already started talking, fast, as if words were his only escape. He had been running away. For days. He felt hunted, cornered. It had been weeks since his life had begun to fall apart, and he didn't know where else to turn. He knew he had lost everything, but even so, he didn't understand why he had come to me. I wasn't the right person to help him. I had left him behind so long ago, and his problems were never mine. The story he told me was confusing, almost incoherent. He had been involved in something I couldn't quite explain, something that had gotten out of control. But what I could understand was clear. A crime had occurred, and he was at the center of it all. Somehow Lucas, my old friend, was the prime suspect in a series of events that had already turned into news headlines. A murder, something horrible, macabre, and his name was in the middle of it all. He explained to me that it hadn't been his intention. He didn't want to be involved. But now, he felt he couldn't escape. The fingerprints were everywhere, and the police were already looking for him. He was marked, and for some reason, he was looking at me with those desperate eyes, waiting for me to help him, to get him out of that situation. What disturbed me most was not what he was saying, but how he was saying it. With every word, the story seemed to get murkier. The rain continued to fall on the car, and the monotonous sound amplified the feeling that we were sinking deeper and deeper into a hole from which it would be impossible to climb out. I wanted to ask him more, to demand answers, but something in his attitude stopped me. I didn't know what to do. He had been my friend, but at the same time, his behavior was beginning to make me doubt everything I once believed about him. What was once simple camaraderie was morphing into something shady, something I couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, as the rain continued unabated, I found myself caught in a spiral of confusion and fear. Lucas insisted that I help him hide. He wanted me to get him out of the country, to get him to safety. But every time I met with him, something didn't add up. The details of his story didn't line up. There were inconsistencies, things that didn't make sense to ask at the time, but as time went on, they became more disturbing. A few anonymous phone calls, some questionable contacts, and finally, a lead that led me to a place I couldn't ignore, the place where the crime had occurred. A small apartment on the outskirts of the city, where a woman had been brutally murdered. The crime scene was macabre. The place was in complete disarray, as if the killer had struggled with the victim. There was blood everywhere, traces of something much darker than simply a robbery gone wrong, the work of a professional. But what left me feeling most claustrophobic was the fact that, among the footprints and traces, I found a photo that seemed to have been taken just before the crime. And in that photo, among the shadows, was Lucas. I couldn't believe my eyes. The key piece, the last one I needed to solve the puzzle, was in front of me, revealing something I would never have expected. The pieces were coming together, but as everything began to fall into place, something inside me was falling apart. My friend, the man I had once known, the man who had trusted me, was involved in something much bigger, much more horrible than I could ever have imagined. What had happened to him? How had it gotten to this point? And worst of all, how could I have been so close to something so heinous without realizing it? I decided to confront him. I could no longer ignore the evidence. I needed to know the truth, so I sought him out. The rainy streets led me to his hideout, that place where he thought he could hide. When I found him, his eyes no longer had that desperate look, that pleading. Now there was only coldness, a coldness I had never noticed in him before. The smile we once shared had evaporated, and in its place only a shadow remained. The man I knew was gone, and what remained was a being I did not recognize. The rain continued to fall, and that night, my life changed forever. As the drops hit the asphalt, I was caught between two decisions, between the weight of loyalty and the weight of justice. Lucas looked at me, and for a moment I didn't know what to do. Should I help him? Should I denounce him? The storm outside did not cease, and with each passing second, time crumbled around me, as did my vision of what had been my life, my friendship. The man in front of me was no longer the Lucas I knew. There was something dark in his gaze, something that told me that, despite his plea, what he had done was unforgivable. And so, as the rain poured down the streets and the echo of the drops filled my thoughts, I made a decision, the only one I could make. I was no longer the friend to whom I owed allegiance. I was no longer the shadow of the past I once shared. I was now the man who had to face the truth, no matter how painful. And that truth, though dark and terrifying, would haunt me forever. The sound of the bars closing for the last time is not something easily forgotten. It is a sound that resonates in the bones, in the head, in the heart. No matter how much time has passed since the gates closed behind me, that claustrophobic feeling, that pang in my chest, it's still there. Always. It's an echo that haunts you, even when you've left. And even though the clanging of those doors no longer sounds, its resonance remains in the soul. I remember the first day, the arrival, that first look inside the prison, that monstrosity of dirty gray walls, of cells that barely gave room to breathe. What I remember most about that first day were not the faces of the prisoners, nor the dense smell of filth and despair. It was the silence. A silence that was not normal, that did not come from the lack of words, but from something much deeper. It was the silence of those who no longer had hope, the silence of men who had ceased to be human. The first days passed in a whirlwind of routine, of faces that became familiar but meant nothing. It was strange to think that we were all the same in that place, that we had all been put into the same sack of human waste, as if it didn't matter what we had done or how we had gotten there. It wasn't the crime that defined you, it was what you did inside. And I still didn't know what to do. I was lost, scared, more than anything. I had made my mistakes in life, yes, but I never imagined I would end up here, surrounded by men who could do anything, who wouldn't stop for anything anymore. The first few days were the worst. I was assigned a cell, but what was really my prison at that moment was not the walls or the bars. It was my mind, my own. I was trapped in it, thinking about everything I had lost, everything I had left behind, my family, my friends. I was thinking about everything that awaited me outside, but also about what could happen inside. It was on the third day when I realized that I was not alone in the cell. It was not the loneliness that frightened me. It was the presence of something much bigger than that. Fear. The feeling that someone was watching me, that there was always someone else in the shadows waiting for a mistake. You couldn't trust anyone. Paranoia was a constant. And it was in that atmosphere of constant tension that I met him. At first I only saw him in the shadows, watching. He had a cold, calculating look. He never said anything. No one did. Men didn't talk. They didn't need to. Looks were enough. When something needed to be said, it was done with hands, with the body, with the steel of a knife, or with the direct violence of a blow. At first I tried to stay out of it. I didn't pick on anyone. I didn't want to get involved in the disputes that arose. I had heard about the gangs, the endless violence that reigned in those walls, but I thought I could avoid all that. I wasn't a fighting man. I wasn't a criminal by nature. I hadn't been before. I didn't want to be now. But it wasn't that simple. One of the first clashes I witnessed was between two men, a dispute over something as insignificant as a pack of cigarettes. But to them, that little thing meant everything. Fists were raised. Knives flashed in the dim light of the corridor. Violence didn't ask permission, didn't ask if you wanted to get involved or not. It was a storm that raged without warning, and you could only try to survive. The sound of the blows was deafening. The men fought furiously without thinking. In the prison, there was no mercy. The weak were devoured, and I understood that quickly. A couple of weeks later, I was dragged into a fight that I had not provoked, but which I was forced to face. At that moment, I understood something important. If you didn't defend yourself, if you didn't show that you were capable of fighting, you became just another victim. I remember it was in that fight that I first noticed him. The guy with the cold stare. He was there in the corner, watching, as usual. He didn't say anything to me. He didn't move. He just watched me with that penetrating gaze that seemed to read my every move, my every thought. I didn't know who he was at that moment, but I realized I couldn't ignore him. He was one of them, one of those who controlled the place, the leaders, the ones who moved the pieces in the shadows. In the days that followed, I began to notice that something had changed. Something inside me. I didn't know it yet, but I was starting to become part of it all. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. Prison changed you. It shaped you. It made you see the world in a different way. Here, survival was the only thing that mattered. If you didn't adapt, you disappeared. And it was when I adapted, when I understood that I could no longer run away, when I realized that what I needed was to be part of that unstoppable force, of that current of violence and fear that was the prison, that I began to walk down a dark path. The guy with the cold stare approached me on one of those nights, when the rain pounded the walls and the wind shrieked like a distant wail. He didn't tell me directly, but I understood. He was inviting me to join, to be part of his world. It was not an easy decision. At first, I thought I could resist, that I could go my own way. But in prison, being weak is not an option. People devour you if you don't show you have strength. And that strength is not always physical. Sometimes a mind that knows how to move in the shadows, that knows how to manipulate others, is more powerful. And that's when I understood. The only way to survive was to be part of it all. I joined, not by choice, but by necessity. The gang I joined taught me what I didn't want to learn. Prison life is not a school of justice. It is a school of survival. And in that world, morality is just an empty word. The rules are simple. Either you are part of the system, or you are a victim. From then on, everything changed. I learned to fight, to think of others only when it benefited me. I learned to do things I never imagined I would do. Things that broke me inside, but that I knew I had to do if I wanted to stay alive. Violence, manipulation, fear became my currency. The days passed, but each time I felt like I was getting further away from who I had been. And then, the day came when everything changed forever. I had been building up power within the gang, waiting for the right moment to take control. The last fight was more brutal than any other I had ever witnessed. The blood, the chaos, the screaming. It was everything I had been building up in my mind. But what really hit me, what tore me apart, was the realization that I had become the very thing I feared most. The ex-con who thought he could maintain his humanity, the man who thought he could escape the darkness, no longer existed. The one who was left now was a distorted reflection of everything he had been. And that is the prison. It's not the walls, it's not the bars, it's not the food. The real prison is in what it makes you, in what you lose in trying to survive. And when I finally got out, there was nothing left of what had been. The door closed behind me, and though the outside world welcomed me, I was no longer a part of it. I was still trapped, in my mind, in my soul. Night guard work in a lonely place has a way of penetrating the soul, like a thick fog that slowly envelops you without you realizing it. At first, when I accepted the position, I thought it would be a monotonous routine, but deep inside, I knew that the lonely hours, the long, heavy nights, would have a strange way of revealing things to me that I'd rather not know. And I wasn't wrong. There was something strange about the place, a kind of density in the air that I couldn't describe. It wasn't the building itself, it was the people, the residents. I was working in a facility for people with special needs, a center away from the city, surrounded by woods and countryside. The place was old, one of those buildings that were built for a purpose that had long since been lost. No one explained to me exactly what was being done there, beyond the official excuse that it was a rehabilitation center for people with severe mental disorders. At the time, I had no reason to question it. I took it for a temporary job without thinking too much about the details. My schedule was simple: Lonely nights, 11 to 7, with the sole task of making sure the doors were kept locked, the cameras rolling, and the residents quiet in their rooms. It seemed like a simple, even boring task, but something told me there was more, much more, behind those walls. The first indication that something wasn't right occurred the first night I spent at the facility. The control room was a small, dark room with barely enough room for a chair and a table full of monitors and buttons. The building was divided into several wings, each more remote and isolated than the last. At first, everything seemed quiet. The monitors showed the corridors empty, the cameras running smoothly. I was alone in that room, surrounded by screens that seemed to fade into the darkness, with the rain pounding on the windows and the wind creating an eerie atmosphere. But then one of the cameras caught my attention. It was the one in the most secluded wing, where some of the more troubled residents lived. In that chamber, something seemed to move. At first, I thought it was a play of light, but when I looked closer, I saw the figure of a man, or at least it appeared to be, standing in the hallway, motionless. My first impulse was to go and see what was going on, but as a night guard, my job was to stay in the control room. I decided to watch a little longer, thinking that maybe it was another resident wandering around, as sometimes happened. However, something made me deeply uncomfortable. The man seemed to be staring directly into the camera, his eyes fixed on the lens, as if he knew I was looking at him. It wasn't normal. The intensity of his gaze chilled my blood. I decided it was time to make a round and check to see if there was a problem. I got up, left the control room, and headed toward that particular wing. As I reached the door, I felt a strange resistance, as if something was blocking my entrance. I didn't see anything out of place, but the atmosphere was charged. The light in the corridors flickered with an eerie intensity, and the silence was thicker than ever. As I walked through the corridors, I felt watched, as if someone was lurking in the shadows. The sensation forced me to quicken my pace. Arriving at the room where the disturbing figure I had seen in the chamber had come from, I found no one. The bed was made, everything was in its place, and the other residents seemed to be asleep. I didn't understand what had happened, but something in the air told me I had to be careful. Something was not right. The next few weeks passed without major incident, but the strange feelings only increased. The residents, though seemingly calm, did not seem like the patients I had been described. Some had blank stares. Others smiled eerily when they thought no one was watching. There was something in their gestures, in the way they moved, that seemed to me disconnected from reality, something that didn't fit. I felt there was a line between them and the real world, a line they never crossed, but that was always there, invisible, separating them from everyone else. Worst of all were the nights, those long, endless hours when time seemed to stand still, and loneliness enveloped me like a wet blanket. I found myself becoming more and more restless, feeling that something was watching me. On several occasions, as I checked the cameras, I noticed that some of the residents of the more remote wing were awake at odd hours. It was not common for them to be up at night. However, there were always one or two who would get up and walk the halls, for no apparent reason. Their movements were erratic, and their eyes seemed vacant, as if they were being guided by an invisible force. One night, while patrolling the building, I came across one of them in the hallway. His face was pale, and his eyes, though open, seemed to see nothing. He was walking slowly, his head tilted to one side, as if listening to something that only he could hear. I dared not approach, but watched from the corner of the hallway, sweat soaking my forehead. It was as if he was lost somewhere far away, not understanding at all what was going on around him. That night, a torrential rain poured down on the building, pounding the windows with a force that echoed throughout the building. I decided to go to the control room to check the cameras, but to my surprise, the screen on one of the monitors was blank. I tried to reset it, but nothing worked. I decided to go check the wiring, and that's when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I was not alone. I didn't know if it was one of the residents or if there was someone else in the building, but the feeling of danger came over me. The air was thick, charged with something I couldn't identify. I decided to return to the hallway, but when I got there, the monitors began to flicker again, and then I saw it. The figure of one of the residents, standing in front of the camera, his face now completely distorted. His eyes seemed larger, darker, and a twisted smile spread across his face, something I hadn't noticed before. The image was so grotesque that I froze, unable to look away. It was as if they were no longer alive, as if something had taken them over, controlled their bodies, but not their minds. That smile, that look, was the same I had seen in the others. They all had something in common, a strange quality that made them different from the others. The next day, I decided to investigate. Something was not right. Something dark was hiding behind those walls. The more I tried to stay away from the truth, the more I was drawn to it. The center's documents were full of flaws and ambiguities, of details that didn't fit, of patients disappearing and returning with even stranger behavior. There was no way this was all normal. Something was going on, and I knew it. Weeks passed and the discomfort grew. The visits to the control room, the cameras turned off, the strange whispers in the dark. The residents were no longer just patients. They were something else. Something sinister. Something that was beyond reason. In the end, I understood that I wasn't there just to protect the residents. I was there to protect myself from them, from what that place had become, but it was too late. The rain was pouring down relentlessly, hitting the windshield of my car hard. I was used to driving in adverse conditions, but that night everything seemed different. Maybe it was the feeling of loneliness, the one that always accompanies me when I travel long distances. The wet asphalt reflected the lights of my car, and through the fogged glass, the darkness seemed to swallow everything in front of me. I was on a deserted road, completely away from the city. I had decided to take the long way, the one that skirted the hills and went through small villages forgotten by the world. There was something about those lonely roads that attracted me. The dim lights of the villages seemed to invite me to keep going, to keep moving aimlessly, just for the pleasure of feeling that I was getting away from everything that bothered me. It was my way of getting rid of the daily burdens, the constant noise of life. However, that night I felt a strange discomfort, something I could not identify. I had been driving for hours, and despite the rain, I hadn't passed anyone on the road. Only the monotonous sound of the engine and the rain hitting the car filled the air. It was the first time I had ever felt so isolated on a trip. The feeling of being completely alone in the middle of nowhere made me uneasy. Then I saw it, or rather, felt it. A car suddenly appeared in my rearview mirrors. A flash of lights, and then the figure of a dark vehicle began to approach rapidly. It was strange. I hadn't seen it the whole drive, and suddenly it was there, right behind me. It accelerated, as if it was chasing me. It wasn't just any car. I could see the headlights reflecting in the rearview mirror. It was so close that I felt uneasy, a strange feeling running through me. There was no reason for someone to follow me on an empty road at that hour. I thought maybe it was a driver in a hurry or someone who just didn't want to waste time. But something wasn't right. The way he was approaching, almost as if he was waiting for me to react, made me tense up. I sped up a bit. Maybe it was paranoia, but something inside me told me I should put some distance. However, I couldn't help but notice that the car behind me was also accelerating, following me with an almost sickening precision. The pace of the engine behind me was growing, and I could feel the air getting thicker. I looked again in the rearview mirror. The light from the headlights shone brighter, almost blinding me. I couldn't see the driver, but I could feel his presence, as if he was watching me with a disturbing intensity. I tried to change lanes, hoping to miss him on a curve or take an exit, but the car followed my every move. It was chasing me in a calculated way, as if it was waiting for something. What did this driver want? Why wouldn't he let me go? Maybe I was being overly dramatic. Maybe I was just an ordinary driver who had nothing better to do at that hour. But the tension had built up in such a way that I began to feel vulnerable. I glanced in my mirrors once more, but the figure in the car was no longer so close. Something inside me told me that I should take advantage of the distance and stop thinking about it. However, when I looked ahead, a flash of lights blinded me for a moment. At first I didn't understand it. I turned quickly and saw, with my heart racing, that the car behind me had pulled up beside my window. I could see the headlights shining, the darkened glass of the vehicle, but I couldn't see the driver. Somehow that darkness was more frightening to me than anything I could have expected to encounter. Suddenly, the car made a sharp turn, right in front of me, blocking my path. The road was too narrow to pass it. I was trapped. My mind started screaming that I had to do something. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I accelerated a little more, trying to find a way out, a way around what was happening. The car in front of me moved slowly, staying in my path. There was no way to overtake them. I couldn't stop in the middle of the road. I felt the pressure grow in my chest. It was a simple game for that driver, a dark game, in which I was the target. I looked in the rearview mirror again. The other car had disappeared. I couldn't see it anymore. I was now completely alone on the road, but the feeling that something was wrong persisted. Maybe the car hadn't really disappeared. Maybe it had been left behind, waiting. I knew something wasn't right. I had to get to the end of that road, get out of there as soon as possible, but the feeling of being hunted wouldn't go away. I kept driving, but as the rain intensified, my nervousness increased. I didn't know what to expect, but I couldn't afford to let my guard down. Then, when I least expected it, I saw him again. At a bend in the road, just when I thought I was rid of him, the car appeared in the distance. This time there were no bright lights to blind me, but I could see his silhouette. It was waiting, parked on the road, as if anticipating my approach. And then suddenly he started moving. I accelerated without thinking. The car behind me was not far behind. It got closer and closer, faster and faster, almost as if it knew I was terrified. What did it want from me? Why was it chasing me? And why couldn't I escape? Fear gripped me. Every curve, every turn, every empty street felt like a trap. It was as if that road was designed to corner me, to keep me trapped. The sound of the other car's engine behind me echoed in my ears, and the rain pounded the glass hard. I couldn't think clearly. I just knew I had to get away. Finally, a desperate idea crossed my mind. The next exit, the next intersection, whatever it was, I had to detour. I had to take a different road. I squeezed the steering wheel hard and took an exit that led me down a side road. The car followed my movement. No matter what I did, no matter how fast I went, it was always there, behind me, as if it was watching me, as if it knew everything I was going to do. I drove for what seemed like hours, always feeling that presence, always knowing I was being chased. I don't know how I knew, but at some point, I knew he had caught up with me. I didn't see his lights. I didn't see anything to tell me he was close, but I felt a pressure in the air, as if everything was about to explode. When finally, on the verge of exhaustion, I decided to stop, the road was empty. The car was gone. I didn't know if the driver had let me go or if he had hidden, waiting for the right moment to strike. In any case, it didn't matter. I was alone again, but I didn't feel it. I was caught up in something much bigger than a simple chase. I never knew who that man was. I never understood why he had pursued me, why he had played this deadly game. The only thing I knew was that my life would never be the same after that night. It was a Friday night. The lights in the office were flickering slightly, as if the electricity was failing. The silence was heavy, like a blanket falling over every corner of the room, crushing every vestige of noise. By this time, almost all the staff had gone home, with the exception of a few stragglers left working on urgent projects. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the very structure of the building was sucking the energy out of those who were still there. I didn't usually stay late at work, but that night I had an important report to finish. My boss had asked me to turn it in by Monday morning. Fortunately, my desk was in a remote part of the office, near a window overlooking the parking lot. It was a perfect place for me to concentrate. Or so I thought. What happened that night I could never have anticipated. My computer screen glowed before me, displaying an unformatted document, words floating meaninglessly, waiting to be organized. My mind was tired, my eyes were beginning to grow heavy. Every now and then I would glance down the empty hallway, feeling the loneliness begin to make me uncomfortable, even if I wouldn't admit it. It was strange to see the office so empty at that hour. The building had an air of desolation about it, and the rain was pounding against the windows loudly, echoing in the silence. In the background, the sound of the air conditioning and the intermittently flickering fluorescent light seemed to amplify the empty feeling. That's when something strange happened. I didn't hear any noise, but I noticed that my computer started behaving strangely. The screen flickered for a moment, as if something was loading or trying to access the network. I leaned forward, tapping the mouse to see if something had gone wrong. A new message appeared on the screen. I thought it was an email or some automatic notification, but as I opened the window, I noticed something odd. The sender's name was unfamiliar. He was not in my contact list. The message said something that made my blood run cold, even though it was short. "Are you still there?" It had no signature or other information. My first thought was that some coworker was playing a joke on me, perhaps someone who had forgotten I was still there. I dismissed the idea immediately. No one in the office was brazen enough to do something like that, much less at that hour. The time on the clock read 11:37 p.m. Most of the co-workers had already gone home, and I didn't know anyone who stayed that late. With a shrug, I closed the message window and went on with my work, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. Perhaps I was too tired, or maybe my mind was playing tricks. I didn't give it much thought, but then the cursor on my computer began to move on its own, without my touching it. The arrow moved nimbly across the screen, opening new windows and closing them quickly. I felt a knot in my stomach as I watched the scene. I decided to restart the computer, hoping everything would return to normal. The screen went off for a moment and then came back on, but something was different. When I logged back in, the system showed me a notification that I didn't remember requesting. Untitled text file appeared in the taskbar. Intrigued, I clicked on it. The file was a simple notepad with text I didn't recognize. I read it quickly and, although it was written erratically, I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. The words made no sense, but something about them felt familiar. At first, I thought someone had left the file open, but when I looked at the date and time it had been created, I felt a cold sweat. The file had been created at exactly 11:34 p.m., right around the time I started noticing the strange thing on my computer. The message read, "Don't leave it. It's too late. Nothing makes sense anymore." The words were strange, kind of choppy. But what terrified me most was not the content, but the fact that the message had no signature, and something else, the way the words seemed to fit my own fears. I couldn't help but remember what had happened months before in the office. A memory floated into my mind, something I had tried to forget, the firing of Ricardo, a former co-worker who had been fired for harassing several employees. Ricardo had not only caused problems within the office, but his behavior had reached an untenable point. For months he had been warned, but he would not stop. He had harassed several people, including a young woman named Sophia, who always seemed nervous and fearful when he was around. The situation reached such an extreme that the managers decided to fire him, and although there was some controversy at the time, the company never made public the exact reason for his dismissal. I thought Ricardo had disappeared, that he had left no trace after his departure, but the uneasy feeling persisted. What had been an office story, a scandal hidden under the rugs, began to take a different shape in my mind. Perhaps there was something else behind it all. A growing sense of paranoia came over me. What if Richard wasn't really gone? What if, somehow, he was still here, in this building? I felt a shudder as I stood up from my desk, glancing nervously around. The office was deserted, but a strange feeling, as if someone was watching, made me stop. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, only the shadows cast on the walls by the flashing lights. I decided to leave the cubicle, take a breath and clear my head. I walked through the empty corridors, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the cold walls. As I approached the common area, my phone vibrated. A message came across my screen. "See you." I froze. The screen showed the same name that had appeared on the computer, Ricardo. Terror gripped me as I stared at the screen. It couldn't be. It couldn't be him. He was fired. He had disappeared, hadn't he? But the next message hit me harder than the first. "I never forgot you. I know what you did. I've been waiting for you to remember." I didn't know what to do, how to react. I began to sweat. The atmosphere in the office, which at another time would have seemed indifferent to me, became a prison, a place charged with anxiety and tension. I decided to head for the exit, to the parking lot. My heart was pounding as I walked. The sound of my footsteps seemed amplified in my mind. The absolute silence of the office was deafening. Just as I reached the end of the hallway, I sensed something wasn't right. Something behind me. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned around but saw no one. The front door was closed, but I could swear I felt a presence behind me. That feeling you can't ignore. Like someone was very close, about to step forward. The phone vibrated again. The message was clear. "It's too late." Suddenly I understood. It wasn't just Ricardo who was watching me. It was everything we had left behind, everything we had tried to forget. The consequences of what happened in that office, the things that had been left unresolved. Was it possible that all this had something to do with the harassment, with the victims, with what happened before Ricardo was fired? The final message came without warning. "You're going to be next." My mind began to burn with questions, but there were no answers. Only the sound of the rain pounding on the windows and the feeling of being watched, trapped in a nightmare I hadn't sought out, but now seemed impossible to escape. The rain was relentless that night. Drops cascaded from the windows of the train, creating a constant symphony of pounding that joined the sound of the engine. There was something eerie about the way the train moved forward, the slight wobble of the cars making the journey seem longer than it actually was. It was a night train, almost empty, with most of the seats unoccupied, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I was traveling alone, on one of those routes through the darkness of the countryside, where station lights flicker sporadically, and the feeling of loneliness seems to intensify with every passing mile. I had never been one to feel uncomfortable traveling alone. On the contrary, I often found myself seeking the tranquility of those solitary journeys. But that night was different. The train seemed to be darker than ever, and the rain, which kept pounding on the windows, only accentuated that claustrophobic atmosphere that was beginning to invade my mind. I looked at my watch. It was already late. The trip had taken longer than expected. I had to reach my destination before dawn, but time seemed to be dragging on. I settled into my seat, feeling the weight of fatigue on my shoulders, but the discomfort prevented me from relaxing. At first, most of the passengers were other lonely travelers, some sleeping, some focused on their phones, and a few talking quietly among themselves. But when we arrived at the next station, a group of young men boarded the car. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, all of them with boundless energy, nervous laughter echoing in the thick air. The car was not that crowded, but they seemed to occupy it completely, as if the presence of that group invaded every corner of the train. They didn't bother me at first. They sat in the nearby seats, laughing, talking unconcernedly. I didn't feel like interacting, so I immersed myself in reading a book I had taken out of my backpack, seeking to distract myself from the increasingly tense atmosphere. But there was something about their attitude that I couldn't ignore. They weren't looking directly at me, but their increasingly audible comments made me uncomfortable. At times I could feel their eyes boring into me, though I tried to remain calm. to continue with my reading, to pretend I wasn't there. But it wasn't long before they began to approach. One of them, a young man with short hair and a pale face, sat in the seat across from me, but his posture was strange, as if he was waiting for something, as if he was measuring the distance between us. His friends were still laughing, casting furtive glances in my direction, but not saying a word directly. The air became thick, charged with an energy I couldn't understand. I didn't understand what happened next. The first nudge was so subtle I almost didn't notice it, but my shoulder jerked hard, a brush that, though slight, was enough to disrupt my concentration. I looked up at the young man in front of me, who had a slight smile on his face, but it was not a friendly smile. Something was going on, something I couldn't define. I refused to look too much, but the discomfort was growing. The murmurs from the group of young people became more evident, and the glances at me more blatant. I felt their eyes weighing on me, as if every word was directed at me. The young man in front of me began to move his legs, to make noises with his feet, making the whole space feel smaller, tighter. A second push came, this time a little harder, as if they were playing games to make me notice, to make me feel invaded. I looked down the aisle, expecting the train to stop at the next station, but it did not. The lights in the carriage flickered at that instant, and for a moment I wondered if it was all part of a bad dream. That's when I knew. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. I was being harassed. The group of young men began to move closer. One sat in the aisle across from me, another began to walk down the carriage, and the whispering continued. I could hear low laughter, but there was also something else, something subtly dangerous in their voices. As if they were planning something, as if they were looking for excuses to make me react. The shoves turned into direct touches. The legs of some of them brushed against mine provocatively, as if they wanted me to pull away, to react. My breathing quickened, and I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck. I tried to ignore them, to look away, but something inside me told me that would only make things worse. I didn't want to make waves. I didn't want to give them the pleasure of seeing my discomfort, but the situation was getting out of my control. The tension was increasing with every second. The vibration of the train against the tracks, the sound of the rain, the flashing lights. It was all coalescing into a feeling of unbearable claustrophobia. The train braked abruptly at a deserted station, and one of the young men stood up as if about to leave. But instead of leaving, he took a step toward me, crouched down and, with a smirk, whispered something I didn't understand, but which made me feel even more vulnerable. The carriage door closed, and the train resumed its march. Now, the feeling that something was about to explode was unbearable. My mind began to work at full speed. What did this group want? How had it come to this situation? I felt like I was trapped in a web of hostility that I couldn't escape, with the walls of the carriage closing in around me. I couldn't help thinking that, at that moment, any attempt to defend myself could trigger something much worse. But then something changed. As the young man stood up again, a faint flash of light briefly illuminated his face, and it was at that instant that I saw something I hadn't noticed before. On his wrist, he wore a bracelet that looked familiar. I recognized it immediately. It was the same one my cousin had worn for a summer, a bracelet with a distinctive pattern that I would never forget. My cousin had been part of a youth volunteer program in his youth, and that bracelet was a symbol of that project. The young man didn't seem to notice my stare, but that simple observation brought everything in my mind into order. The bracelet reminded me of something I'd completely forgotten. My cousin, who was involved in a youth safety project, had mentioned that many of the kids involved in that program ended up with security jobs or in law-related settings. That bracelet, I knew, was not just an accessory. Suddenly, I understood that the young man harassing me was not just a stranger. There was something behind his attitude. Perhaps, in fact, it was not a direct threat. Instead of falling into paranoia or reacting impulsively, I decided to remain calm. I remembered that my cousin had trained many young people to deal with this type of situation, and he knew how to diffuse a tense situation quickly. When the young man leaned toward me, this time, instead of standing still, I responded with a direct question, a firm tone, but without hostility. I watched him calmly as he looked at me, confused by my change of attitude. I watched his face slowly change from arrogant to puzzled. I began to tell him about my cousin, casually mentioning his name and how he had talked about his experience with such programs. At that moment, the mood changed. The pressure eased, and for the first time all night, the young man seemed uncomfortable. His friends looked at him, and the tension vanished, at least for a moment. The group fell silent as the murmurs died down. The young man returned to his seat without a word. The atmosphere of menace that had enveloped the carriage disappeared. The rain was still falling, but it was no longer the same. The train moved forward without that claustrophobic air. My heart was still pounding, but now I could breathe more easily. What had begun as a dangerous situation had changed, not because of a confrontation, but because of a simple change of perspective. I had done what I had to do, stay calm, and use what I knew to my advantage. Sometimes, the threat comes not just from what we see, but from what we know. And that night, my knowledge of something as simple as a bracelet saved the day. The rest of the trip was uneventful, and upon arriving at my destination, I felt stronger, as if I had passed an unexpected test. The storm had started soon after I woke up, as if the sky shared my uneasiness, as if even the weather foreshadowed the storm that would be unleashed in my mind. I woke up sweaty, a bad dream still fresh in my thoughts. But what disturbed me most was not the dream, but the feeling of discomfort, that something was about to change forever. I stood up, feeling the weight of years on my shoulders. It had been 15 years since I had met Elisa, and I had never felt so disconnected from the woman with whom I had shared my life. I met her when we were young, just kids, and like many love stories, it seemed like everything was perfect. We married when we were 24, and together we had our daughter, Sophia, who was the light of our eyes. She had been my everything, the result of a love I believed to be pure, unbreakable. But that morning, everything changed. Everything. It was as if I had been living a lie, and suddenly the truth had hit me full on, leaving a deep wound that could not heal easily. A couple of weeks ago, I started noticing little things, little details that didn't match up, but at first I had ignored them. Maybe it was paranoia, I thought, or maybe just the wear and tear of years. But that morning I couldn't ignore it anymore. I knew when I saw that old envelope in my office drawer. It was no ordinary envelope. It had the seal of a city hospital on it. I had never seen it before, not even in my dreams. I had never seen it before. My mind began to race, and without much thought I took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a letter, but it wasn't just any letter. It was a medical letter. A letter that took my breath away. A report on a paternity test performed years ago, almost 17 years ago, at a hospital I didn't even remember existed. Throughout the letter, the words seemed to repeat over and over in my mind, as if the universe was echoing a noise that was getting louder and louder. Paternity test. Conclusive results. Biological father identified. Marcos. The blow was so loud that I dropped to my knees on the floor. My mind couldn't process it. Marcos? My brother? How could that be possible? What had Elisa done? The air in the room seemed to become thick, and the noise of the storm outside was drilling in my ears, as if the drops themselves were screaming my despair. The letter continued, detailing the test results. It was clear. Sophia was not my daughter. Sophia was my brother's daughter, Marcos. At that moment, everything I had thought I knew about my life crumbled like a house of cards. I stared at the letter for a long time, as if deep down I could deny what I was reading, as if I could find some clue, some sign that it was all a mistake, a misunderstanding. But the words remained the same, and they became clearer and clearer. My daughter was not mine. The daughter I had cared for, that I had loved, that I had watched grow up, was not really my daughter. The rain was lashing against the windows, as if the storm was mirroring the internal storm raging in my mind. The sound of the wind, the gusts of water, seemed to envelop the house, to fill every corner with a sense of claustrophobia that I could not bear. There was something indescribable in that instant, a feeling of emptiness that consumed me, as if all the love I had given during those years was now just a sham. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay with that letter in my hand, with that revelation sweeping through my world. I stood up quickly, not knowing what to do, not knowing where to turn. I looked at the photo of Sophia on the office desk. It was her, the little girl I had watched grow up, the one I had held in my arms for the first time, the one who had been my reason for being for all those years. But now I could not see her in the same way. My eyes were beginning to see someone else, to see my brother. It was impossible, but there was the proof. I felt the need to talk to Elisa, to confront her, to demand answers. But something inside me told me that I was not ready to listen to what she was going to tell me. What would she tell me? How would she explain this to me? I didn't know if I was ready to face it. The storm outside the window was still raging, as if nature itself was crumbling what had been my life. I left the office mindlessly, paper in hand, my mind spiraling into chaos. When I got to the living room, my daughter Sophia was sitting on the couch, watching TV, oblivious to everything that was about to happen. When she saw me enter, she smiled at me, and for a moment, the weight of the letter disappeared. But the smile faded when she saw my face. Something must have been in the air, because his expression changed. At that moment, something inside me snapped even more. I walked over to her, knelt down beside her and looked into her eyes, but the words wouldn't come out. I was trapped in my mind, trapped in the darkness that had invaded my heart. I didn't know how to explain to her, how to explain myself. The sound of the wind and rain outside intensified, and that's when I saw her. Elisa appeared in the doorway, as if she had known that this moment would come sooner or later. Her face was marked by concern, but when she saw the letter in my hands, her expression changed. It was as if, in that instant, everything became clear to her as well. As if the whole lie we had lived together for so many years was about to crumble in front of our eyes. I could not look at her. I could do nothing but wait for her to speak. Even though I already knew what she was going to say, I knew her words would be like knives, sharp, cutting. But she said nothing. Instead, she slowly walked over, sat down across from me and began to speak in a low tone, almost a whisper. I couldn't quite hear what she was saying, but I understood enough. He had deceived me. He had lied to me all that time. Sophia was his daughter, yes, but not mine. And not only that, Marcos, my brother, had been the real father. What came next was a mixture of anger and despair. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to react. There were so many unanswered questions, so many things that needed to be explained. The storm outside was still lashing the house, as if it wanted to erase everything that had happened that night, but I couldn't escape the truth. I stared at Elisa, looking for something in her eyes that would give me the strength to go on, but there was nothing. The love I had felt for her had disappeared, as if it had never existed. It was all a lie, a deception that had lasted too long. And the worst part, the most unbearable part, was that I couldn't believe that my own blood, my own brother, had done this to me. My mind clouded over, fear and anger intertwined into one feeling, and when the rain finally stopped, something inside me also calmed down. I no longer felt fear. I only felt emptiness. I decided that I couldn't go on with it, that it was all over. The storm had stopped roaring, but inside me, the hurricane continued. I knew I had to leave, that I had to rebuild my life, even if the road to the truth had torn my soul out of me. As I left the house, the rain had stopped completely. The air was cool, but my mind was still trapped in that chaos. I didn't know what the future would bring, but one thing was certain. My life would never be the same again. Everything had changed, and the raindrops that were no longer falling on my skin were still falling inside me, reminding me that nothing was the same anymore.